Hey guys, tonight we are embarking on an exceptionally ancient, almost timeless journey. We're not just stepping back a few centuries or even a couple of millennia. Oh no. Tonight we are venturing deep, deep into the heart of a vast sunburnt continent, into a past so profound that it stretches back tens of thousands of years to explore the incredible stone carvings and the enduring stories of ancient Indigenous Australia. Imagine yourself, if you will, standing not in your familiar room, but under a vast, star-drenched outback sky, the air still warm from the departed sun, the ancient weathered rocks around you seeming to hum with a silent and almost palpable energy. These stones, Egeria, are not just geological formations. For countless generations, they have been the sacred canvases, the enduring libraries, the whispering storytellers of the world's oldest continuous living cultures. Now, trying to navigate the complexities and profound spiritual landscape of ancient Australia, with its intricate kinship systems, its deep understanding of a land teeming with both sustenance and significant peril, its sacred geography imbued with the power of the dreaming, and its absolute non-negotiable rules about which particular, and often surprisingly, if not fatally, venomous creature you most definitely should not attempt to poke with a pointy stick. All without the guidance of a very wise and incredibly patient elder who holds the traditional knowledge. Your chances of having a long, prosperous, or indeed even just a briefly unbitten and generally non-catastrophic existence would be, let's just say, significantly, almost miraculously enhanced by having such an expert guide. It was and is a land of incredibly deep knowledge, and sometimes equally deep and immediate consequences for ignorance. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're drifting off from tonight on our journey to the Dreamtime. Drop your location and what time it is in your part of the world in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your journey, Egeria, takes you to a continent of breathtaking antiquity, a land that has been home to human beings for an almost unimaginable stretch of time. A mainstream historical fact, one that continually astounds and reshapes our understanding of human history, is that Indigenous Australians possess the oldest continuous living cultures on Earth, with archaeological evidence and genetic studies confirming their presence on the Australian continent for at least 65,000 years, and possibly much, much longer. We're going so far back in time, tonight Egeria, that the magnificent pyramids of Giza, those ancient Egyptian wonders we so often think of as symbols of deep antiquity, would look like brand new, almost vulgarly modern upstart constructions by comparison. We're talking about a time frame that stretches back to when Neanderthals still roamed Europe, when giant megafauna like diprotodons, imagine a wombat the size of a small rhinoceros, still browsed the Australian bush, a time long before bread was even a hopeful twinkle in a wild grass seed's eye. Imagine this ancient land, vast, diverse, and often challenging. There are sun-scorched deserts where the red earth stretches to an endless horizon, lush tropical rainforest teeming with unseen life in the north, rugged mountain ranges carved by millennia of wind and rain, dramatic coastlines pounded by the Pacific and Indian Oceans, and those iconic weathered rock escarpments and sandstone outcrops that rise like ancient sentinels from the plains. For the first peoples of this continent, this land was not just a physical space to be inhabited or exploited. It was and is a living, breathing entity, a sacred geography imbued with spiritual power, crisscrossed by the dreaming tracks of great ancestral beings who shaped every rock, every river, every plant, and every animal in the very beginning of time. Their connection to country, a term that encompasses not just the land itself, but its stories, its laws, its spirits, its very essence, is one of profound kinship, intricate custodianship, and deep spiritual belonging. A relationship far removed from later European concepts of land as mere property to be owned and divided. In this ancient world, knowledge, law, history, and spirituality were not primarily recorded in written texts, bound in leather or inscribed on clay tablets. Instead, they were carried in the hearts and minds of the people, transmitted through a rich and complex oral tradition, through sacred songs, intricate dances, communal ceremonies, And very importantly for our sleepy exploration tonight, through art, particularly the enduring art etched into stone. These ancient stone carvings or petroglyphs found across the Australian continent in countless thousands of sites are not just primitive decorations or idle doodlings. They are in a very real sense an ancient library in stone, a vast open-air archive of human experience, belief, and connection to place, stretching back into an almost unfathomable antiquity. These are etched stories, visual narratives that speak of the dreamtime or the dreaming, as many Indigenous people prefer emphasizing its ongoing, ever-present nature, that foundational sacred era of creation, when the great ancestral beings roamed the earth, shaping the landscape, creating all living things, and establishing the laws, customs, and moral codes that would govern human life forever. The stones themselves seem to whisper these ancient secrets, Egeria. If only we knew how to truly listen, how to read their silent, enduring language. The dreaming is not just a collection of quaint creation myths from a long-dead past. It is a living, breathing reality, a metaphysical framework that underpins all aspects of traditional Indigenous Australian life spirituality law and relationship to country. It is the past, the present, and the future all interwoven. It tells of how the land itself was sung into existence, how the mountains and rivers were formed by the journeys and actions of giant serpent sky heroes or totemic animal ancestors. It explains the origins of human beings of different language groups, of social customs, of sacred sites, and of the intricate kinship systems that bind people to each other and to their land. And the rock art, these carvings etched into the very fabric of that sacred land, served as vital mnemonic devices, as illustrations for these profound oral narratives, as maps of ancestral journeys, as charters for land ownership and ritual responsibility, and as powerful conduits for accessing the spiritual power inherent in these sacred sites. The precise dating of many ancient Australian rock art sites, particularly the deeply patinated petroglyphs, which can be incredibly difficult to date directly, and the exact nuanced interpretation of their most abstract or regionally specific symbols, without the direct guidance of initiated traditional knowledge holders from that specific cultural group, remain subjects of ongoing intensive and often highly complex scientific and archaeological research, all requiring respectful collaboration between archaeologists, anthropologists, geochronologists, and most crucially contemporary Indigenous elders, and communities who are the living custodians of this immense cultural heritage, and often hold the keys to understanding the deeper meanings embedded in these ancient images. A quirky or fringe tidbit that beautifully illustrates the immense antiquity and continuity of this artistic tradition is that some ancient Australian rock art sites, particularly in regions like the Pilbara in Western Australia, home to the Murujuga Rock Art Province, one of the largest and oldest petroglyph complexes in the world, or Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, depict creatures that are now long extinct, such as giant flightless birds, or even what some researchers have tentatively identified as megafauna, like Palercestes, a kind of marsupial tapir, or Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion. Other carvings seem to show environmental conditions from the last ice age, such as risen sea levels or different vegetation patterns. It's like finding a remarkably detailed, scientifically accurate eyewitness sketch of a dinosaur, but one drawn by someone whose ancestors actually saw its distant giant furry and possibly rather grumpy marsupial cousin wandering through their backyard tens of thousands of years ago. The depth of time is simply staggering. So as you settle into your sleepy journey tonight, Agraya, prepare to let the everyday world recede. We are venturing into a landscape of ancient stones and even more ancient stories, a place where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual is beautifully, almost imperceptibly blurred. Australia beckons with its sunburnt rocks and its etched memories, ready to whisper its Dreamtime secrets to those who approach with an open heart and a quiet, listening mind. You are now standing Egeria at the very threshold of ancient Australia, a land of immense antiquity, its weathered rocks and vast sun-drenched landscapes echoing with stories that stretch back to the dawn of human consciousness on this continent. You've glimpsed how those enduring stone carvings, those petroglyphs we are here to explore, serve as a kind of silent, sacred library, holding the accumulated wisdom law and spiritual understanding of the world's oldest continuous living cultures. But to even begin to appreciate the stories from ancient Indigenous Australia that these carvings might whisper, we must first, with profound respect and a willingness to set aside our own modern preconceptions of time and reality, try to understand the foundational worldview that underpins them all. The complex, multifaceted, and deeply spiritual concept, often translated into English as the dreaming or the Dreamtime, a mainstream historical fact and one that is absolutely central to any understanding of Indigenous Australian cultures, is that the dreaming, a term that many Indigenous groups themselves now use when communicating in English, though they also have their own specific, rich linguistic terms for it in their diverse languages, is far more than just a collection of quaint creation myths or stories about a long-vanished once upon a time. Haike, it is a profound and ongoing spiritual, cosmological, and legal framework that encompasses the past, actively informs the present, and shapes the future. It is the very source of all life, all law, all knowledge, all social relationships, and the unbreakable sacred connection between people, their ancestors and their country, the land to which they belong. Trying to fully grasp the multi-layered depth and all-encompassing nature of the dreaming, if you're coming from a typically linear, secularized Western perspective, Egeria is a bit like trying to understand the entirety of, say, quantum physics, advanced string theory, and the complete works of Shakespeare by reading only the IKEA instruction manual for a particularly complicated but ultimately rather utilitarian flat-pack bookshelf. You might get a sense of the general shape and some of the basic components, but you're almost certainly going to miss a few crucial dimensions. The profound underlying interconnectedness and the bit about the talking kangaroos. With surprisingly good advice on existential matters, though, that last part might be more specific to certain stories, of course. The dreaming refers to that foundational sacred era of creation, often described as a time before time, when great ancestral beings, powerful, often immense creator spirits, cultural heroes or totemic ancestors who might take human, animal, plant, or even elemental form like a rainbow, a storm, or a specific rock formation, journeyed across a previously featureless or unformed land. As these ancestral beings traveled, they didn't just have a casual meandering stroll across ancient Australia, perhaps stopping for a divinely inspired picnic here and there. Oh no, they were actively creating the world as we know it. They sang mountains into existence, their powerful voices shaping the very contours of the ranges. They dreamed rivers into flow, their movements carving out the watercourses. They created all living things, the animals, the plants, and eventually human beings themselves, often forming the first people out of the earth or transforming themselves into specific human groups or clans. These ancestral beings weren't just having a particularly eventful Monday morning in the pre-dawn of existence. They were literally laying down the blueprint for all of creation, and their every action, every journey, every song, every sacred sigh was imbued with profound, world-shaping power. Crucially, as these ancestral beings moved across the land, they left behind their spiritual essence, their power, their very being in the landscape itself. Specific rock formations, waterholes, trees, caves, mountain ranges. These were not just inert geographical features. They became sacred sites imbued with the presence and the story of the ancestor who had shaped or interacted with them. These interconnected sites, following the paths of the ancestral beings, form what are often called dreaming tracks, or songlines. Vast and visible to the uninitiated, yet profoundly real spiritual maps that crisscross the entire continent, linking different language groups, different ceremonies, and different stories into a cohesive continent-wide tapestry of sacred geography and shared or sometimes specifically owned ancestral knowledge. For traditional Indigenous Australians, Egeria, a particular seemingly unremarkable outcrop of rock isn't just a rock. It's the very place where, say, the great Yemao ancestor, in a fit of pique after a rather heated debate with the Kookaburra spirit about whose laugh was more annoyingly infectious, stubbed his giant celestial toe with such force that he created a sacred permanent waterhole, and in doing so also simultaneously invented the first truly effective Emwa polka, the steps of which are still reenacted in ceremony today. Every landmark has a story, a sacred significance, and you'd better know that story and respect that significance, or you might find yourself inadvertently offending a very powerful and possibly rather easily disgruntled geological feature with a long memory. But the dreaming is not just about this distant primordial creation period. It is also the source of the law, often referred to by specific regional indigenous terms like Chukorpa in some Central Australian languages. This law established by the ancestral beings during their creative journeys encompasses all the rules for correct social behavior, kinship obligations, marriage systems, land ownership and custodianship, moral codes, hunting and gathering practices, and very importantly, the precise performance of sacred ceremonies, songs, dances, and rituals. This law is not a static, unchanging set of ancient rules gathering dust on some forgotten stone tablet. It is a living law, a dynamic and ever-present force that continues to govern life and maintain the order of the cosmos. It is constantly reaffirmed, re-energized, and passed down from generation to generation through the meticulous performance of ceremony, the retelling of dreaming stories, the singing of sacred songs, the tracing of traditional designs, and, crucially for our sleepy exploration through the creation and ritual maintenance of sacred art, including those enduring stone carvings. The precise ways in which the incredibly diverse and regionally specific Indigenous Australian concepts and worldviews, often encapsulated by broad English terms like the dreaming, the dreamtime, or the law, were successfully maintained, adapted, transmitted, and reinterpreted across tens of thousands of years of continuous human culture, particularly in the face of significant and sometimes catastrophic environmental changes, such as ice ages. Rising sea levels that drowned vast coastal plains or prolonged periods of continental aridity remains a profound and deeply humbling area of collaborative research, involving archaeology, particularly rock art dating and analysis, anthropology, linguistics, indigenous oral traditions and living cultural knowledge, and even genetic studies, all seeking to understand the resilience and dynamism of these ancient belief systems. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the interconnectedness and vast scale of some dreaming narratives is that certain major songlines or dreaming tracks can traverse hundreds, even thousands of kilometers, passing through the traditional lands of many different language groups. The stories, songs, and ceremonies associated with these tracks are shared in part by all the groups whose country they cross, creating vast networks of shared spiritual and cultural heritage, a kind of continent-wide sacred and entirely orally transmitted spiritual GPS and story-sharing network. The rock art sites, those ancient galleries of stone carvings and paintings, are therefore not just pretty pictures or primitive decorations. They are often sacred sites in themselves, places where the power of the dreaming is particularly concentrated, where ancestral beings left their mark, or where important creation events occurred. The images etched into the rock are visual manifestations of these dreaming stories, these laws, these ancestral connections. They are mnemonic devices, teaching tools, ceremonial focuses, and powerful statements of identity, belonging, and enduring spiritual presence in the land. Understanding this profound, all-encompassing embrace of the dreaming Egeria is the essential first step to appreciating the true depth, meaning, and sacred power held within those ancient whispering stones. You are now Egeria, beginning to grasp the profound, all-encompassing spiritual worldview of ancient Indigenous Australia, that vibrant living tapestry known as the dreaming. You understand that for these first peoples, the land itself was not just a physical space, but a sacred sentient entity shaped and imbued with power by the great ancestral beings during that foundational creation era. Every rock, every river, every distinctive landmark held a story, a connection to the law, a whisper from the dreamtime. And one of the most enduring, most powerful ways in which these stories, these laws, and this sacred connection to country were recorded, transmitted, and kept alive for tens of thousands of years was through the remarkable art form we are here to explore. Tonight, the ancient stone carvings or petroglyphs that adorn countless rock surfaces across the vast Australian continent. It is time to consider the very stone itself as a canvas, and the patient skilled hands that transformed it into an eternal library of ancestral knowledge. Forget your delicate linen canvases, your smoothly prepared gesso panels, or your modern glowing digital tablets. The ancient Indigenous Australian artists, for many of their most enduring works, chose the most ancient, most elemental, and most challenging canvas of all the living rock of the land itself. A mainstream historical fact is that petroglyphs or rock carvings represent a major and incredibly ancient form of Indigenous Australian rock art found in numerous sites across the continent. These are images created not by applying pigment, as in rock paintings or pictographs, which are another equally fascinating tradition that we might touch upon, but are not our primary focus tonight, but by physically altering the surface of the rock itself. By pecking, incising, abrading, or hammering away the dark, weathered outer skin, or patina of the rock, to expose the lighter, unweathered stone beneath, or by carving lines and shapes directly into the rock face. This choice of stone as a medium speaks volumes. It speaks of permanence, of a desire to create messages that would endure for millennia, weathering the sun, the rain, and the passage of countless generations. It speaks of a deep intrinsic connection to the land, where the stories of the dreaming were not just on the land, but literally etched into its very fabric, becoming an integral part of its sacred geography. And it speaks of immense labor patience and profound skill for shaping images on unyielding stone, with only the simplest of tools was no easy task. This wasn't just a casual afternoon hobby aguria, like idly sketching in a notebook. This was serious, often sacred work. What were the techniques employed by these ancient artists to transform a blank rock face into a vibrant panel of story and symbol? The primary methods as identified by archaeologists and rock art specialists include pecking. This involves striking the rock surface repeatedly with a harder stone, often a pointed piece of quartz or a durable igneous rock, to create a series of small dots or pits. By carefully controlling the density and placement of these peck marks, the artist could gradually form an outline, fill in a shape, or create a textured surface. Imagine the rhythmic percussive sound echoing through a quiet rock shelter, or across a sun-baked escarpment, the patient, almost meditative tapping of stone against stone, slowly, painstakingly bringing an image forth from the ancient rock. Incising or engraving. This technique involved using a sharp-pointed stone tool, perhaps a flake of flint chert or quartzite, to cut or scratch lines directly into the rock surface. This could create fine, delicate lines suitable for intricate details or deeper, broader grooves for more bold and graphic images. It required considerable pressure and control to achieve consistent, meaningful lines on often very hard rock. Abrading or grinding. Sometimes after an image had been initially outlined by pecking or incising, the artist might then rub or grind the carved areas with another stone, perhaps using sand and water as an abrasive. This would smooth out the peck marks or incised lines, creating broader, more uniform surfaces, or sometimes a polished effect. It could also be used to create shallow, dish-like depressions or smooth, rounded forms. And of course, these techniques could be combined. An artist might peck out the main outline of a figure, then incise finer details, and perhaps abrade certain areas to give a sense of depth or texture. The tools themselves were deceptively simple, often just carefully selected pieces of natural stone shaped by necessity, and wielded with immense skill and traditional knowledge. Their artistic toolkit wasn't exactly a well-stocked trip to the local Bronze Age or even Stone Age craft superstore. Right then, esteemed colleagues. An ancient Indigenous artist might confer with their assistants before commencing a particularly ambitious new rock art panel, depicting, say, the epic journey of the great rainbow serpent across the newly formed landscape, for today's monumental masterpiece, which will undoubtedly resonate with spiritual power for the next 40,000 years or so. I shall require one particularly sharp and pointy rock for the fine detail work on the serpent's iridescent scales, one reassuringly hefty and comfortably grippable rock. For the more enthusiastic percussive pecking of the background, Dreamtime dust bunnies, and a very, very large, almost infinite supply of patient dedication. And perhaps someone could rustle up a few roasted witchetty grubs for our mid-millennium snack break. This, as you know, could take a while. Over the vast spans of time, thousands, even tens of thousands of years, these petroglyphs undergo a natural aging process. The carved surfaces initially exposing the lighter fresh rock beneath gradually begin to repatinate to weather and darken, sometimes almost blending back into the original rock face, their ancient messages becoming fainter, more elusive, like whispered secrets from deep time. The degree of patination can sometimes, though very cautiously, be used by researchers as a relative indicator of age. The carvings can vary enormously in style, from deep, bold grooves to incredibly fine, almost invisible scratches, reflecting different regional traditions, time periods, artistic intentions, and the varying nature of the rock itself. The precise interpretation of the different petroglyph creation techniques observed at various Indigenous Australian rock art sites. For example, whether subtle variations in pecking density, the depth or width of incised lines, or the choice of specific tools for different motifs carried particular symbolic meanings, indicated the work of different individual artists or schools, or simply reflected purely practical considerations, such as the type and hardness of the rock surface, or the availability of suitable stone tools at that specific time and place, is an area where archaeologists and rock art specialists continue to conduct incredibly detailed stylistic, technological, and microscopic use-wear analyses. A particularly fascinating, quirky, or fringe tidbit that highlights the enduring spiritual significance of these sites and their images is the evidence found at some ancient petroglyph locations of regrooving or repecking of much older carvings by later generations of Indigenous people. This wasn't an act of vandalism or an attempt to improve upon the original art. Rather, it was likely a ritual act of renewal, a way of re-energizing the sacred power inherent in the images, of maintaining the connection with the ancestral beings and the dreaming stories they represented, and of reaffirming the ongoing cultural and spiritual ownership of that sacred place. It's like an ancient, incredibly sacred version of, hey, that really important carving of the great Mu spirit's journey to the moon is looking a bit faded and indistinct after the last few thousand years of sun and rain. Someone grab a suitably hard, spiritually attuned rock, and let's respectfully repeck its sacred left nostril and perhaps give its cosmic tail feathers a bit more definition. We can't have a spiritually underwhelming or visually indistinct ancestral emu representing us to the cosmos, now can we? The creation of these petroglyphs was clearly not art for art's sake, in our modern, often individualistic sense. The act of carving itself, often undertaken at highly sacred sites, was likely a ritual performance imbued with ceremony song and deep spiritual intent. The images created were not just decorative, they were powerful, functional, and integral to the maintenance of law tradition and the spiritual health of both the people and their country. These stone canvases Agraya were chosen for their permanence, their connection to the very bones of the earth, ensuring that the stories, the laws, and the sacred presence of the dreaming would endure etched forever into the ancient listening heart of the Australian continent. You are now, Egeria, beginning to appreciate the profound artistry and deep spiritual intent behind those ancient Indigenous Australian stone carvings. Those petroglyphs pecked, incised, and abraded into the very fabric of the land by countless generations of First Peoples. You understand that these were not mere idle scratchings, but enduring records of the dreaming sacred texts, etched onto the most permanent canvas imaginable, each mark a testament to a continuous living culture stretching back into an almost unfathomable deep time. But where can you in your sleepy imaginative journey actually encounter these timeless galleries, these vast open-air repositories of ancestral knowledge and story? While rock art sites are found across the entirety of the Australian continent, from the tropical north to the temperate south, and from the coastal fringes to the arid heart, there are certain regions particularly renowned for the sheer scale, antiquity, and breathtaking significance of their stone carvings. Let us first journey in our minds to the northwest coast of Western Australia, to a place known to its traditional custodians, the Yaburara, Mardudunera, and Wanggutiu peoples, among others, and more widely as Murujuga or the Burrup Peninsula. A mainstream historical fact is that Murujuga is home to one of the largest and oldest concentrations of petroglyphs in the entire world. We are talking about an almost unbelievably vast outdoor art gallery with hundreds of thousands, possibly even over 1 million individual rock engravings scattered across its rugged, iron-rich hills and valleys, overlooking the turquoise waters of the Indian Ocean. Murujuga isn't just a few interesting carvings on a couple of conveniently located rocks in Giria. It's more like the Louvre, the British Museum, the Uffizi Gallery, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art all decided to have a colossal open-air collaborative baby, but one made entirely of intricately carved ancient stone engravings covering an entire coastal peninsula and featuring significantly more beautifully rendered kangaroos, sea turtles, and enigmatic human figures with very interesting headdresses. You would need several lifetimes, a team of highly dedicated pack animals, or perhaps a very sturdy air-conditioned, all-terrain vehicle, and an inexhaustible supply of sunblock and fly repellent to even begin to see it all. The rocks themselves at Murujuga are distinctive. A dark reddish-brown igneous rock called gabbro or granophyre, which has developed a deep desert varnish or patina over millennia of exposure to the sun and elements. The ancient artists created their images by pecking or hammering through this dark outer layer to expose the lighter, unweathered rock beneath, creating a striking contrast that makes the carving stand out, especially in the raking light of dawn or dusk. The age of some of these engravings is truly staggering. While precise dating is always challenging, some researchers using various scientific techniques and stylistic analyses have proposed dates for the earliest art at Murujuga, stretching back 40,000 years or even more, placing them among the oldest known artistic expressions of humankind anywhere on the planet. The subject matter is incredibly diverse. You would see countless depictions of animals, both marine and terrestrial fish turtles, dugongs, crabs, and perhaps even whales from the nearby sea, kangaroos, emus, lizards, snakes, and dingoes from the land. There are human figures often engaged in activities like hunting, dancing, or participating in ceremonies, sometimes adorned with elaborate headdresses or carrying spears and boomerangs. And then there are the more abstract or geometric symbols, circles, grids, radiating lines, complex patterns, whose precise meanings are often known only to initiated indigenous knowledge holders, but which undoubtedly carried deep cultural and spiritual significance. There has even been some tantalizing, though debated, speculation about whether some of the older carvings might depict now extinct megafauna that roamed Australia during the Pleistocene Ice Age. The precise interpretation and exact cultural significance of the vast and highly complex arrays of geometric patterns and abstract symbols, found alongside more clearly figurative depictions in many major Australian petroglyph sites like Murujuga, and whether these non-figurative marks represent maps of country kinship diagrams, sacred symbols, mnemonic devices for recalling stories or songs, or perhaps even forms of early notation or proto-writing, remain subjects of intense ongoing research, profound discussion, and respectful collaboration between archaeologists, anthropologists, and most importantly, Indigenous elders, who are the rightful custodians and interpreters of this ancient heritage. Now let us journey in our minds far to the east to the sandstone country of the Sydney Basin in New South Wales. Here, in a very different geological and ecological environment, another vast and ancient tradition of rock carving flourished among the Eora Ku-ring-gai and other Indigenous language groups. The Sydney petroglyphs are typically found on large, relatively flat expanses of Hawkesbury sandstone, often on ridgetops or near water sources. The style is often quite different from Murujuga, large, deeply pecked or abraded outlines of figures rather than filled-in forms. You might see life-sized or even larger-than-life engravings of kangaroos, wallabies, emus, goannas, fish eels, and very impressively enormous whales, reflecting the importance of both terrestrial and marine resources to the coastal peoples. There are also numerous depictions of human figures, often in ceremonial poses, perhaps ancestral beings or cultural heroes, as well as tracks of animals and humans and enigmatic symbols like circles, lines, and grids. Imagine living in ancient Sydney, Nigeria, long before the arrival of the First Fleet. Your local park, that familiar sandstone outcrop where you might gather with your family, isn't just a place for a pleasant picnic or a bit of casual spear sharpening. It's a sacred open-air gallery, its surfaces covered with giant, awe-inspiring carvings of the great creator emu spirit, performing the first sacred dance, or the heroic whale ancestor, breaching from the Dreamtime ocean. Now watch your step there, little ones. A parent might caution their children, try not to inadvertently trip over that rather important 4,000-year-old life-sized sandstone engraving of Uncle Barry, the benevolent bandicoot spirit. He's exceptionally culturally significant, you know, and also his nose is surprisingly pointy if you run into it at speed. These sites were not just random collections of images. They were often carefully chosen locations imbued with spiritual power, used for teaching younger generations about the dreaming, for conducting initiation ceremonies, for marking territorial boundaries, or for performing rituals to ensure the continued abundance of food resources, or the spiritual well-being of the community. The act of creating the art and of regularly visiting and perhaps even retouching or renewing older carvings was itself a vital part of maintaining the connection to the dreaming and the ancestral powers of the land. Looking at some of these incredibly ancient geometric symbols, Jiria, without the benefit of direct indigenous cultural knowledge, can sometimes feel like trying to decipher an incredibly complex, beautifully rendered alien instruction manual for assembling a flat-pack universe. Oh, okay, so these three perfectly pecked concentric circles positioned directly next to that rather assertive zigzag line and what appears to be a stylized representation of a particularly thoughtful echidna clearly and unequivocally means either this is an excellent spot for finding delicious yams and also watch out for snakes, or possibly herein lies the sacred portal to the seventh dimension of the Great Platypus Nebula, but only on alternate Tuesdays if the moon is in Sagittarius. Yes, Nan? It's all in the interpretation, really, and usually we don't have the key. There are, of course, countless other significant rock-carving regions across Australia. The magnificent petroglyphs of the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, with their unique Adnyamathanha stories. Important sites in Central Australia connected to Arrernte Luricha and other desert peoples. And even in Tasmania, where ancient hand stencils and some simple pecked designs predate the island's separation from the mainland. Each region has its own distinctive styles, its own unique repertoire of motifs, and its own profound connection to the local dreaming stories and the ancestral landscape. These are not just art galleries in our modern museum sense. They are living cultural landscapes, places where the past, the present, and the spiritual world are inextricably interwoven, where the stones themselves still whisper those ancient sacred stories to those who know how to listen. You have now, in your sleepy, imaginative wanderings, Egeria stood in awe before the vast, ancient, and utterly breathtaking outdoor art galleries of Indigenous Australia. You've pictured the sun-baked, iron-rich rocks of Murjuga in Western Australia, teeming with perhaps 1 million individual petroglyphs, their pecked surfaces whispering tales of marine life, terrestrial animals, and enigmatic human figures from a past so deep it almost defies comprehension. You've also glimpsed the distinctive large-scale outline carvings on the sandstone platforms of the Sydney Basin, where giant whales, kangaroos, and ancestral beings seem to dance across the very fabric of the land. These are not just isolated artistic expressions. They are entire landscapes imbued with sacred story, timeless galleries where the dreaming itself is etched into enduring stone. But what of the images themselves? What are the common symbols, the recurring motifs that these ancient artists so painstakingly pecked, incised, and abraded into the rock? And what might these silent forms tell us about their world, their beliefs, their stone carvings and stories? As you approach these ancient rock panels, Egeria perhaps in the soft light of dawn or the long shadows of late afternoon, you begin to discern a recurring, if wonderfully diverse, visual language. A mainstream historical fact is that Indigenous Australian rock art, including the petroglyph traditions we are focusing on, employs a rich and incredibly complex repertoire of symbols and motifs. Many of these are deeply, inextricably connected to the dreaming, to the journeys and actions of ancestral beings, to totemic systems that link people to specific animals and plants, and to the sacred laws and ceremonies that govern life. While some of these motifs, like easily recognizable animal tracks, might seem straightforward to an outsider, the true meanings of many, particularly the more abstract symbols like circles, lines, and intricate geometric patterns, are often highly context-specific, multi-layered, and best understood through the lens of living Indigenous cultural knowledge, where such knowledge can still be appropriately shared. Trying to definitively decode all these ancient symbols without direct guidance from a knowledgeable elder of that particular country is a bit like attempting to understand the complete works of Shakespeare, all the nuances of Elizabethan courtly intrigue, and the deeper philosophical underpinnings of Hamlet's existential angst, armed only with a very basic picture-based children's alphabet book, and a vague sense that something important probably happened here. Context. Egeria. Context is everything, and often the deepest context remains within the custodianship of the first peoples themselves. However, we can explore some of the common types of symbols you might encounter in these stone galleries. One of the most frequent and immediately recognizable motifs is that of animal tracks. You'll see the distinctive three-toed print of an emu, the splayed V shape of a kangaroo or wallaby track, the sinuous line of a snake, the footprints of goannas, possums, or various birds. These are not just simple representations of local fauna. Yes, they can indicate the presence of these animals in the area, perhaps serving as a kind of hunting map or a record of a successful hunt. But more profoundly, these tracks often represent the animal itself in its totemic or ancestral form, or they can trace the path of a specific dreaming story, the journey of an ancestral being who took on that animal's shape as it moved across the land, creating significant sites and establishing law. Similarly, you might find human footprints sometimes called mundo in certain regions. These too can signify the presence or journey of ancestral beings, or perhaps the tracks of initiated individuals participating in a ceremony or even a claim to that particular piece of country by a specific kin group. Circles and concentric circles are another incredibly common and often highly symbolic motif found in Indigenous Australian rock art across the entire continent. Their meaning can be incredibly diverse and context-dependent. A simple circle might represent a campsite, a waterhole, a vital resource in many arid regions, a meeting place, or even a specific sacred site associated with a particular dreaming story. Concentric circles can carry even more complex layers of meaning, perhaps indicating a place of increased spiritual power, different levels of initiation or knowledge, or even celestial bodies like the sun or the moon. Sometimes they are interpreted as representing parts of the body or even as symbols of female creative power. Their abstract nature makes them particularly difficult for outsiders to interpret without specific cultural knowledge. But their ubiquity underscores their profound importance in the indigenous symbolic system. Lines in their myriad forms, straight, wavy, zigzag, meandering also abound. A straight line might represent a path, a journey, or a boundary. Wavy lines can signify water, a river, a snake moving through water or rain lightning, or the movement of an ancestral serpent. Zigzag lines might also represent lightning water or sometimes the markings on a ceremonial object. These lines often connect other symbols, creating a kind of visual narrative map across the rock face. The precise iconographic meaning and the intended narrative function of many of the more abstract or highly stylized geometric motifs found in ancient Indigenous Australian petroglyphs, particularly those from very, very early periods, some of which might predate known ethnographic parallels by tens of thousands of years, or those found in regions where direct ethnographic links to living cultural knowledge have unfortunately been severed by the impacts of colonization, remain subjects of considerable ongoing scholarly debate, meticulous scientific research including advanced dating techniques and digital image enhancement, and respectful collaborative consultation with Indigenous communities where possible. It's a constant process of trying to listen to what the stones are trying to tell us, often across a vast chasm of time. More overtly figurative, of course, are the depictions of human-like figures or anthropomorphs. These can range from very simple, almost schematic stick figures to far more detailed and naturalistic representations. Their postures are often highly significant. Are they dancing as if in a ceremony? Are they shown hunting with spears or boomerangs? Are they engaged in a fight? Are they standing in a position of authority or reverence? Often these figures are not just ordinary mortals. They represent ancestral beings themselves, cultural heroes from the dreaming, or perhaps participants in sacred rituals. Their bodies sometimes adorned with ceremonial body paint, which we can infer for carvings. but see directly in painted rock art, elaborate headdresses, or carrying ritual objects. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that sometimes rock art sites across Australia show what appear to be remarkably accurate and detailed maps of the local landscape. These are not maps in our modern cartographic GPS-enabled sense with precise scales and north arrows. Rather, they are symbolic representations of country showing the interconnectedness of sacred sites, important water sources, good hunting or foraging areas, and the dreaming tracks that link them all together. These visual maps would have been invaluable tools for teaching younger generations about their specific country, its resources, its stories, and their custodial responsibilities towards it. Imagine a young Indigenous child learning their geography not from a textbook, but by tracing the ancient sacred lines pecked into a sun-warmed rock face by their ancestors thousands of years before. The tools and weapons of daily life and occasional conflict also feature in these stone galleries. You might see clear depictions of boomerangs, both returning and non-returning hunting varieties. Spears, sometimes with spear throwers or womeras to increase their range, and power shields often decorated with specific clan designs and perhaps even digging sticks or coolamans carrying dishes used by women. These images provide valuable insights into the material culture and subsistence practices of these ancient peoples. And sometimes, Ageria, your gaze might be drawn upwards to consider if the sky above finds its echo in the stone below. Did these ancient artists also carve their understanding of the celestial world? It's highly plausible. Circles might represent the sun or moon. Clusters of dots could be stars or constellations. Some researchers have even proposed that certain arrangements of symbols might align with significant astronomical events or represent specific sky-dreaming stories. Though proving such celestial connections definitively across vast millennia is, as you can imagine, an exceptionally challenging task. Decoding these ancient motifs, Ageria is like trying to read a profoundly complex and deeply sacred visual language, where each symbol can have multiple layers of meaning and where the full understanding often depends on a lifetime of cultural immersion and initiated knowledge. Looking at some of these incredibly ancient geometric symbols with their intricate patterns and their non-literal forms can sometimes feel like trying to decipher an alien instruction manual for assembling a particularly complex, flat-pack universe. Okay, so these three beautifully pecked, perfectly concentric circles positioned directly next to that rather assertive, deeply incised zigzag line and what appears to be a stylized representation of a particularly thoughtful and philosophically inclined echidna, clearly and unequivocally means either this is an exceptionally good waterhole located 3 days' walk from here, just past the place where the rainbow serpent had a slight disagreement with the Lightning Brothers, or it could possibly mean, beware the impending wrath of the giant, metaphysical, and slightly grumpy space wombat who dislikes anyone whistling after dark. It's all in the interpretation, really. And usually for us outsiders, we're missing about 99.9% of the crucial culturally embedded interpretive context. But even without grasping their full, deep meaning, these symbols in stone stand as a powerful testament to the rich intellectual, spiritual, and artistic lives of Australia's first peoples. A timeless gallery whispering its enduring secrets. You have now, Ageria, journeyed in your sleepy imagination to some of ancient Australia's most remarkable, timeless galleries. Those vast, sun-baked rock surfaces in places like Murujuga or the Sydney Basin, intricately adorned with countless thousands of petroglyphs, pecked incised and abraded images that have endured for millennia. You've begun to familiarize yourself with the common visual language of these stone carvings. The animal tracks that are more than just footprints, the human-like figures engaged in mysterious activities, the enigmatic circles, lines, and grids that seem to hint at a deeper symbolic code. But these motifs, however fascinating in isolation, rarely stand alone. They are often arranged in complex panels, interacting with each other, creating what can only be understood as visual narratives, etched gospels, if you will, that give enduring stone form to the profound, foundational stories of the dreaming. It is here in these creations' echoes carved deep into the rock that we can glimpse how these ancient artists recorded and transmitted their understanding of the world's very beginnings and the sacred laws that govern all life. A mainstream historical fact, and one that is absolutely central to appreciating Indigenous Australian rock art, is that a vast number of these petroglyphs are understood by their traditional Indigenous custodians and interpreted by researchers in respectful collaboration with them as direct visual representations of dreaming narratives. These are not just random pictures or decorative patterns. They are integral parts of a complex oral and ceremonial tradition, serving as mnemonic aids for storytellers, as illustrations of sacred histories, as maps of ancestral journeys, and as tangible links to the creative and spiritual power of those great ancestral beings who shaped the land and all life within it during that primordial dreamtime. These aren't just any old bedtime stories casually etched into convenient rock faces Egeria. Oh no. This is truly epic universe-creating, law-giving, society-founding stuff we're talking. Chapter 1. The Great Rainbow Serpent emerges from the primordial void and decides to invent rivers, valleys, and possibly also Tuesday afternoons. It was a very busy couple of eons. Followed by Chapter 2. How the sun was accidentally stolen by a particularly greedy bat spirit, and why the heroic Kookaburra brothers are still universally admired for their clever plan, involving a very large, very sticky spiderweb and an unexpectedly loud laugh to get it back. Truly blockbuster material, all rendered in painstakingly pecked and incised stone. Imagine yourself, Egeria, standing before a sprawling panel of these ancient carvings. Perhaps in the soft, slanting light of an outback dawn. With the guidance of a knowledgeable elder whose wisdom, alas, we can only imperfectly channel in our sleepy narrative, you might begin to see not just isolated symbols, but an interconnected story unfolding across the rock face. Those meandering lines, which at first glance seemed abstract, might now reveal themselves as the sacred dreaming track. The songline of a particular ancestral being. Perhaps the kangaroo ancestor, or the emu woman, or the two sisters, tracing their epic journey across the primordial, still formless land. The concentric circles so common in much of this art might mark the specific locations where these ancestors rested, where they performed important ceremonies, where they dug for water, thereby creating permanent water holes where they left parts of their spiritual essence or where significant transformations occurred. These are not just patterns, they are sacred waypoints, spiritual landmarks, and a vast orally transmitted map of creation. You might see carvings depicting the very formation of the landscape itself. A series of undulating lines could represent the rainbow serpent, that immensely powerful creator spirit found in many indigenous cultures across Australia, as it moved across the earth, its giant body carving out riverbeds, valleys, and mountain ranges. A cluster of deep peck marks might signify the place where an ancestor thrust their digging stick into the ground, causing a sacred spring to well up. The stories etched in stone often directly explain the origin of the natural features you see around you, making the entire landscape a living, breathing testament to the creative acts of the dreaming. The origin of species, too, is a common theme. You might see a panel showing a human-like ancestral being gradually transforming into a specific animal or plant, thereby creating that species and establishing its totemic connection to a particular human kin group. The intricate carvings of kangaroos, emus, fish, goannas, and other creatures are not just naturalistic depictions. They are often imbued with this ancestral significance, representing the totemic embodiment of dreaming power, the very essence of that species as it was first brought into being. And of course, there are the depictions of the first human beings themselves, and how they received the law from the ancestral beings. Carvings might show groups of figures engaged in what appear to be the first sacred ceremonies, perhaps learning the songs, dances, and rituals that would ensure the continuation of life, the fertility of the land, and the proper relationship between humans' nature and the spiritual realm. These are in effect the founding charters of their society, the visual records of their most sacred covenants. The precise narrative content and the exact symbolic syntax or grammar of many of these highly complex Indigenous Australian petroglyph panels, particularly those that feature a dense interplay of numerous abstract or very highly stylized motifs, whose direct ethnographic interpretations by living knowledge holders may have been lost over time due to the impacts of colonization, or which remain restricted sacred knowledge not openly shared with outsiders, continue to be subjects of profound scholarly research and ongoing respectful interpretation. often requiring a deeply collaborative, multidisciplinary approach that carefully integrates detailed archaeological recording and analysis, comparative anthropological studies of indigenous symbolic systems, and most crucially, an ethically direct consultation and partnership with the relevant traditional indigenous custodians of that specific country and its stories, where such engagement is possible and welcomed. A quirky or fringe tidbit that illustrates the dynamic, ongoing nature of some of these rock art traditions is the phenomenon observed at certain very ancient and continuously utilized sacred sites of superimposition or layering. Here, newer carvings are sometimes found pecked or incised directly on top of much older, more heavily patinated ones. To an untrained Western eye, this might look like vandalism, a defacement of ancient art, but from an indigenous perspective, it often signifies the exact opposite: the site's enduring sacred importance, its continuous ritual use over vast millennia, with new generations respectfully adding their own layers of story, ceremony, and spiritual connection to the same powerful ancestral place. It's like an ancient, incredibly sacred, multi-generational palimpsest, where the stone itself becomes a living document, constantly being re-inscribed and re-energized by the ongoing presence of the dreaming. It's not, oops, great uncle Ngabalak, you accidentally pecked your emu track right over great-great-great Aunt Warita's sacred yam. Dreaming from the last ice age. It's more like, ah yes, we are respectfully adding our own contemporary layer of ceremonial significance to this already profoundly sacred place, reaffirming our connection to all the ancestors who have come before us and left their mark upon this living stone. The interplay between clearly figurative elements like easily recognizable animals or human-like figures, and more abstract or geometric symbols, those circles, lines, grids, and dots, is key to how these stone carvings tell their stories. The figurative elements might identify the main actors in a dreaming narrative, the specific ancestral being the totemic animal. The abstract symbols, on the other hand, can convey a wealth of other information: the location of sacred sites, the pathways of ancestral journeys, the presence of spiritual power or energy, concepts of kinship or social structure, or even elements of sacred law that are not meant to be depicted too literally or openly. You might see a panegyria with a clear carving of a kangaroo surrounded by a complex array of concentric circles, radiating lines and rows of pecked dots. To us, it might just look like a rather artistic kangaroo having a very abstract, slightly dotty sort of day. But to an initiated elder possessing the deep cultural knowledge, that entire panel might instantly unfold as a detailed and sacred chapter of a much larger dreaming saga, perhaps recounting the epic journey of the great kangaroo ancestor, the specific sacred sites he created along his path, the circles, the spiritual power he left at each one, the radiating lines, and perhaps even the specific ritual obligations, the dots that his human descendants must perform at those sites to ensure the continued well-being of both the kangaroos and their country. It's all about knowing the sacred footnotes, the deeply embedded cultural context. Imagine, Egeria, the sheer dedication, the immense effort, the profound spiritual commitment involved in creating these enduring narratives in stone. To want to tell a story so important, so foundational to your entire worldview, that you decide to meticulously carve it. Peck by patient peck line, by careful line, into a giant unyielding rock face, using only another slightly pointier rock. Just to make absolutely sure that the story will last, that it will be there to teach and guide your descendants for, perhaps the next 40 or 50,000 years or so. That, Egeria, is some serious next-level commitment to ensuring that your children and your children's children and their children for countless generations to come do not ever forget the really, really important plot points like always respect your elders and your ancestral beings. Don't forget to perform the sacred ceremonies that keep the kangaroos plentiful and the yams delicious. And most importantly, never ever under any circumstances annoy the great rainbow serpent when she's trying to have a quiet nap in her favorite waterhole. These are creation's echoes carved deep for all time. You have now, Egeria, begun to appreciate how those ancient indigenous Australian petroglyphs, those stories etched deep into the enduring stone canvases of Murujuga or the Sydney Basin, are far more than just collections of isolated symbols or decorative patterns. You understand that they are often visual narratives, mnemonic maps of sacred knowledge illustrating the profound, all-encompassing creation sagas of the dreaming. These are tales of how the land itself was sung into existence, how rivers were carved by the passage of immense spiritual beings, how mountains were raised by their mighty actions. But who are the protagonists of these epic stone-etched narratives? Who are these formidable spirits, these cultural heroes, these totemic progenitors whose forms and journeys are so meticulously immortalized on these ancient rock faces? It is time, Egeria, to encounter the ancestral beings themselves. A mainstream historical fact, and one that is absolutely fundamental to understanding the deepest meanings of Indigenous Australian rock art, is that a very significant portion of these carvings, and indeed paintings as well, depicts these ancestral beings. These are the powerful, often supernatural entities who, according to the diverse dreaming narratives of hundreds of different Indigenous language groups across the continent, were responsible for the very creation of the world as it is known. Its landscape, its flora, its fauna, human beings themselves, and crucially, the sacred law that governs all existence. These ancestral beings aren't gods in the sense of a hierarchical Olympian pantheon ruled by a Zeus-like figure, nor are they distant, aloof creator deities who simply wound up the cosmic clock and then retired to some celestial country club. Oh no, they are far more intimately, more actively, and more continuously present in the Indigenous worldview. They are the original shapers, the first lawgivers, the great cultural heroes, the totemic ancestors from whom specific clans or language groups trace their descent and their spiritual connection to particular animals, plants, or places. And their power, their essence, their stories are still very much alive in the land and the ceremonies, and most visibly for us in these ancient rock carvings. These ancestral beings, Egeria, weren't your average run-of-the-mill mythological figures who might say invent a slightly better type of mousetrap, or perhaps win a divine singing contest. These were beings who were out there in the primordial Dreamtime, literally singing entire mountain ranges into existence, dreaming vast river systems into flow, occasionally having rather epic celestial arguments with each other, that resulted in the creation of particularly interesting and unusually shaped rock formations, and generally laying down the entire spiritual and physical blueprint for all of subsequent reality. Their resumes, you can imagine, were pretty impressive, and their rock art portraits, when you encounter them, are often even more so. How are these formidable spirits depicted on the rock faces? Their forms are incredibly varied, reflecting the immense diversity of Indigenous Australian cultures and dreaming stories. Sometimes they appear in human-like or anthropomorphic form. These figures are often clearly distinguishable from representations of ordinary mortals. They might be significantly larger in scale or depicted with exaggerated or unusual physical features. They might wear elaborate headdresses, intricate body paint patterns, which we can infer for carvings, but see directly in many painted rock art traditions, or carry specific ceremonial objects or sacred implements. Their postures can be highly significant. Perhaps they are shown dancing in a ritual, standing in a position of authority, or engaged in some specific creative or transformative act from their dreaming story. In other instances, ancestral beings are depicted in animal form, zoomorphic. The kangaroo ancestor, the emu ancestor, the goanna ancestor, the fish ancestor, or perhaps most famously and widespread across many regions, the rainbow serpent, an immensely powerful creator, being often associated with water rain fertility and the shaping of rivers and gorges. These are all common. The carvings of these animals, as we've touched upon, are rarely just simple naturalistic representations. They embody the spiritual essence, the dreaming power of that particular ancestral being. Sometimes you might encounter hybrid forms figures that blend human and animal characteristics, or beings with other overtly supernatural attributes, such as multiple limbs, unusual heads, or emanating lines of power. These hybrid depictions often serve to emphasize the transformative, shape-shifting nature of many ancestral beings, their ability to move between different forms and different realms of existence. And in many cases, particularly in some of the oldest or most abstract rock art traditions, an ancestral being's presence, their journey, or their creative acts might be indicated not by a direct figurative depiction at all, but by highly symbolic or abstract signs. Those enigmatic circles, U-shapes, meandering lines, grids, or arrangements of pecked dots that we encountered earlier. For initiated individuals within that specific culture, these abstract motifs would be instantly recognizable as representing a particular ancestor, a specific dreaming track, a sacred site imbued with their power, or a key element of their creation story. The precise identification of specific ancestral beings in some of the older, more weathered, or highly abstract petroglyph traditions, and the full unraveling of their associated mythological narratives and complex ceremonial significances, especially in regions where direct ethnographic links to living indigenous cultural knowledge have been tragically broken, or where such knowledge is considered highly restricted and not for public dissemination, often relies on incredibly careful, painstaking comparative analysis, requiring scholars to compare motifs with known dreaming stories from wider geographical regions, look for linguistic clues in place names or surviving song fragments, analyze the structural relationships between different symbols within a single rock art panel or across an entire site, and always with utmost respect engage in collaborative research with indigenous knowledge holders where such partnerships are deemed appropriate and culturally sanctioned. The power and significance of these depictions of ancestral beings, immortalized on stone, cannot be overstated. Firstly, these carvings were not just static pictures of these ancestors. They were often considered to be imbued with, to embody, or to act as direct conduits for the spiritual presence and ongoing power of those very same ancestral beings at that particular sacred site. The rock art panel was a place where the dreaming was made manifest, where the creative energies of the ancestors were still palpably present. Secondly, these images served as crucial visual reinforcements of the law Chukurpa, or its regional equivalents. By depicting the ancestors and their creative acts, the carvings constantly reminded people of the law's customs and responsibilities that these beings had laid down for human society and for the proper care of country. Thirdly, these rock art sites, particularly those featuring major ancestral figures, were often, and in many cases still are, highly sacred ceremonial locations. Specific rituals, songs, and dances connected to those particular ancestors and their dreaming stories would be performed at these sites, often by initiated individuals, to renew the spiritual power of the place, to ensure the continuity of life and resources, or to pass on sacred knowledge to new generations. And fourthly, they were, of course, invaluable teaching tools, visual textbooks used by elders to instruct younger people in the complex narratives of their dreaming, their totemic connections, their kinship obligations, and their sacred responsibilities to their country and their law. Imagine yourself Egeria as a young indigenous child being brought by an elder to a sheltered rock face covered in these ancient carvings. The elder points to a series of pecked lines and circles, to a faded but still discernible figure with an emu's head and a human body. And as they begin to chant the ancient song to tell the sacred story associated with that emu ancestor, the carvings on the rock would come alive in your mind, no longer just static images, but vibrant characters in an epic ongoing drama of creation. You might be trying to identify precisely which specific great emu spirit, or slightly grumpy but profoundly wise wombat ancestor, is depicted in a particular 20,000-year-old rock carving. Is that, you might hesitantly ask your elder guide, Great Uncle Barry the benevolent bandicoot, the one who, according to the song, taught us how to find the sweetest yams after that rather unfortunate misunderstanding with the Moon Woman? Or is it perhaps a highly stylized early period representation of the primordial platypus who sang the stars into existence and also invented the first really effective spear thrower? The headdress, you see, is just a little bit ambiguous to my untrained eye, a quirky or fringe tidbit that often fascinates researchers is the occasional depiction in rock art of ancestral beings, with what appear to be unusual or exaggerated features. Perhaps multiple limbs, strangely shaped heads, elaborate and almost otherworldly headdresses, or even in some more recent painted traditions, though the underlying concept might be ancient internal anatomical details showing through the body like an X-ray style of depiction. These features are rarely just artistic whimsy. They almost invariably signify the ancestors' supernatural power, their specific attributes or abilities as described in their dreaming story, or perhaps their capacity to transform between human and animal forms. When you Egeria gaze upon these formidable spirits etched onto the ancient rock faces of Australia, you are not just looking at art in our modern gallery sense. You are looking at a profound spiritual statement, a tangible connection to the very wellspring of creation, a testament to the enduring power of the dreaming, and a silent, powerful assertion of indigenous identity and belonging in an ancient, sacred land. You get the distinct feeling looking at some of these deeply pecked, immensely old carvings of powerful ancestral beings with their huge, staring eyes that they are looking right back at you. Perhaps judging your choice of rather inappropriate European traveling attire, your less than perfect understanding of sacred kinship laws, and your general slightly bewildered, touristy demeanor. It's a very profound and just possibly a slightly unnerving art gallery experience, unlike any other in the world. You are now standing Egeria within the heart of an ancient Indigenous Australian rock art gallery. The weathered stone face is around you alive with the pectin-sized and abraded forms of a world shaped by the dreaming. You've begun to understand how these are not mere pictures, but profound visual narratives, sacred texts etched into the very bones of the land, illustrating the epic journeys and creative acts of those formidable ancestral beings who sang the world into existence. And as you look closer, you realize that many of these powerful creator spirits, these cultural heroes and totemic progenitors, are often depicted in or closely associated with the diverse and fascinating fauna of the Australian continent. The animal carvings you see are rarely just simple representations of local wildlife. They are portraits of power embodiments of ancestral essence, rendered with a reverence that speaks volumes about the intricate spiritual interconnectedness of all life in the Indigenous worldview. A mainstream historical fact, and one that is immediately apparent to anyone who studies this ancient art form, is that Indigenous Australian rock art, across its vast continental spread and immense time depth, features an extraordinary and diverse array of animal depictions. These images are absolutely central to their mythology, their spiritual beliefs, their totemic systems, and their understanding of country. These are not just idle sketches of the local kangaroos and emus done by a bored hunter whiling away a hot afternoon. In these carvings, a particular animal is often far more than just its physical self. It is a manifestation of a specific dreaming being, a totemic ancestor for a particular clan or language group, or a key player in a sacred creation narrative, or along a vital songline. In these ancient carvings, Egeria, a kangaroo isn't just a kangaroo bounding gracefully across the plains. It's quite possibly your great-uncle Barry, the primordial kangaroo ancestor, the very same one who in the Dreamtime heroically stamped his mighty foot upon the barren earth to create the first sacred waterhole, and who also incidentally happens to know the secret traditional recipe for the most spiritually uplifting and nutritionally complete witchetty grub souffle. So, you know it's wise to show some proper respect when you encounter his image and maybe leave him a small, entirely symbolic offering of particularly nice freshly pecked grass or a beautifully arranged pile of auspiciously shaped pebbles. The range of fauna depicted is as vast as the continent itself. In the rock shelters and escarpments of Arnhem Land, though more famous for its paintings, some engraved traditions exist there too. You might see powerful saltwater crocodiles, long-necked, tortoises, and a myriad of fish and water birds, reflecting the rich biodiversity of its monsoonal floodplains and estuaries. In the arid landscapes of Central Australia, you'd encounter carvings of kangaroos, wallabies, emus, goannas, snakes, and perhaps dingoes, all creatures adapted to that harsh environment, and all playing significant roles in local dreaming stories. Along the coast, like at Murjuga or in the Sydney Basin, marine life features prominently. Fish of all shapes and sizes, sea turtles, dugongs, crabs, And even as we've noted, enormous awe-inspiring whales, their immense forms pecked into sandstone platforms overlooking the very ocean they inhabit. These animal depictions are often rendered with a remarkable degree of observational accuracy, at least in terms of their key identifying features or characteristic postures. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some ancient rock art sites seem to function almost as comprehensive field guides or visual encyclopedias of the local fauna, showcasing a wide range of species with such detail that modern zoologists can often identify them quite specifically. This suggests a profound, intimate, and incredibly detailed observational knowledge of the natural world, passed down through countless generations. A knowledge essential not just for physical survival, knowing what to hunt, what to avoid, but also for spiritual understanding, as these creatures were so deeply interwoven with the sacred narratives of the dreaming. The artists weren't just vaguely sketching a generic bird. They were often depicting a specific type of bird with its characteristic beak shape, its typical stance, its unique way of moving, all because those details might be crucial to the story or the ceremony associated with that particular bird ancestor. It's like having David Attenborough as your primary artistic influence, but with several millennia more direct field experience, a much better understanding of the spiritual significance of wallaby mating dances, and a significantly more limited palette. Mostly just various shades of rock, really. Hunting scenes are also a common theme in these petroglyphs. You might see human figures armed with spears, boomerangs, or spear throwers woomeras in pursuit of kangaroos or emus. But these are rarely just straightforward depictions of a successful hunt for dinner. They often carry deeper meanings, perhaps illustrating the correct ritually prescribed methods of hunting, according to the law laid down by the ancestors. They might depict a specific dreaming story about a great ancestral hunt, or serve as part of an increased ceremony. A ritual performed at a sacred site to ensure the continued abundance and fertility of that particular animal species, thereby maintaining the balance of nature and the sustenance of the human community. There is often a profound sense of respect for the hunted animal evident in these depictions. It is not just prey, but a fellow being within the interconnected web of the dreaming. A life taken with reverence and often with specific ritual protocols. But perhaps the most tantalizing and certainly one of the most debated aspects of animal depictions in ancient Australian rock art Egeria is the possibility that some of the very oldest carvings might represent now extinct megafauna. Those giant animals that roamed the Australian continent during the Pleistocene Ice Age tens of thousands of years ago. The positive identification and conclusive interpretation of possible depictions of extinct megafauna such as giant kangaroos, diprotodons, those rhino-sized marsupials, Genyornis, the giant flightless bird, or Thylacoleo, the so-called marsupial lion, in very ancient Indigenous Australian rock art, remains a highly debated and often quite contentious topic among archaeologists, paleontologists, and rock art researchers. It requires exceptionally rigorous analysis of stylistic conventions, careful assessment of associated archaeological dating evidence, which is often indirect for petroglyphs, and detailed zoological plausibility arguments. As such images, if definitively verified, would have truly profound implications for understanding the immense antiquity of the art itself, the longevity of oral traditions, and the nature of human megafauna interactions in Pleistocene Australia. Imagine Egeria seeing a deeply patinated, undeniably ancient carving that looks suspiciously like a creature that, according to the fossil record, vanished from the Earth 20,000 or 30,000 years ago. It's like finding a perfectly preserved, remarkably accurate prehistoric selfie taken with a creature that should by all rights only exist in dusty museum dioramas and rather alarming paleontological textbooks about things that could, if they so chose, squash you entirely flat without even noticing. Yep, an archaeologist might cautiously mutter, peering at such an image that certainly does bear a rather uncanny resemblance to Diprotodon optidum. Or perhaps it's just a particularly large, unusually shaped, and artistically misrepresented wombat with a glandular problem. Further research and possibly a much stronger cup of tea is clearly required. Whether depicting familiar kangaroos and emus, vital fish, and turtles, Or those tantalizingly possible ancient megafauna, these animal forms etched with such reverence into the stone, are far more than just a catalog of Australian wildlife. They are potent symbols of ancestral power, key characters in the epic narratives of the dreaming embodiments of totemic identity, and vital links in the sacred chain of life that connects the first peoples to their country, to their law, and to the very dawn of creation itself. Each peckmark, each incised line speaks of a world where the boundaries between human, animal, and spirit were fluid and deeply interconnected. You have now, Egeria, marveled at the incredible diversity of animal forms etched with such reverence into the ancient stone canvases of Indigenous Australia. You've seen how kangaroos and emus, fish and turtles, and perhaps even those tantalizing, ghostly images of long-extinct megafauna are far more than mere wildlife illustrations. They are potent symbols, embodiments of ancestral beings, key players in the epic narratives of the dreaming, and vital links in the sacred chain of kinship that binds people to their country. But alongside this rich and varied fauna, the rock art galleries of ancient Australia are also populated by another equally fascinating and often even more enigmatic set of figures representations of human beings themselves, or at least beings in human-like form. It is to these human shapes, with their often hidden meanings and their diverse portrayals as dancers, hunters, or powerful ceremonial figures, that we now turn our sleepy, curious gaze. A mainstream historical fact is that human-like figures, or anthropomorphs as archaeologists often term them, are a common and highly significant motif in Indigenous Australian rock art, including the petroglyph traditions we are primarily exploring. These figures vary enormously in style, detail, and apparent activity across the vast expanse of the continent, and its immense time depth, from simple, almost schematic stick figures pecked into a rock face tens of thousands of years ago, to far more detailed, naturalistic, or highly stylized and elaborately adorned representations from later periods. And just like the animal carvings, these human shapes are rarely, if ever, just casual portraits of everyday people going about their mundane business. More often, they are deeply imbued with spiritual significance, representing ancestral beings and human guise participants in sacred ceremonies. Legendary cultural heroes or potent spirits from the dreaming. Imagine yourself, Egeria, tracing the outlines of these ancient stone carvings. You might encounter a simple stick figure, perhaps with splayed fingers and toes, its very minimalism, conveying a sense of primal energy or ancient simplicity. Is it an ordinary person or a depiction of a spirit, or perhaps even an ancestor in a highly abstracted form? Then you might see more detailed human outlines, sometimes in profile, sometimes front-facing their limbs, often depicted with a dynamic sense of movement. Are they running, jumping, hunting with spears or boomerangs, or perhaps engaged in a vigorous ceremonial dance? Sometimes these figures are shown with exaggerated features, perhaps very large heads, unusually long limbs, or prominent sexual characteristics, all likely signifying specific aspects of their identity or their role in a particular dreaming story. Some of these carved human figures, Egeria, are depicted wearing what appear to be quite elaborate and rather impressive ceremonial headdresses, intricate body paint designs. Even if the carving itself is monochrome, the incised or pecked patterns might represent designs traditionally painted onto the body for ritual occasions, or carrying specific sacred objects, ceremonial poles, or symbolic weapons. It's like stumbling upon the ancient Australian equivalent of the Met Gala, but one that has been meticulously carved into enduring stone. And the theme for this particular eon is primordial ancestral chic, with a distinctive hint of emu feathers and a touch of sacred ochre. Very avant-garde, very spiritually significant. Who then do these diverse human shapes represent? Often they are depictions of the ancestral beings themselves, those powerful creator spirits who, as we've seen, could take many forms, animal, human, or even hybrid. When appearing in human guise, they are usually shown engaged in the significant creative acts of their dreaming journeys, shaping the landscape, bestowing sacred law upon the first people performing the first ceremonies, or perhaps engaging in epic struggles with other spiritual entities. These are not just pictures, they are sacred presences. They might also represent mythological heroes or founding ancestors of specific clans or language groups. their stories and deeds immortalized in stone to be passed down through generations. The carvings serve as vital mnemonic devices, visual touchstones for the complex oral narratives that recount their importance. Frequently, these human figures are clearly depicted as participants in ceremonies. You might see lines of figures in repetitive dance postures, their arms raised, their knees bent, conveying a sense of rhythmic movement and collective ritual action. They might be shown wearing masks or specific ceremonial attire, holding musical instruments like clapsticks, though these are more often inferred than explicitly detailed in very ancient carvings, or interacting with sacred symbols or totemic animals. These scenes are invaluable, if often enigmatic, glimpses into the rich ceremonial life that was so central to Indigenous Australian spirituality and the maintenance of the dreaming. The precise identification and exact symbolic interpretation of many of the more highly stylized or abstract anthropomorphic figures found in ancient Australian petroglyphs, particularly those from very early archaeological periods, or those found in regions where direct ethnographic links to living Indigenous cultural traditions and specific dreaming stories have unfortunately been broken or are now lost due to the devastating impacts of colonization, remain exceptionally challenging for researchers. This often requires a very cautious multidisciplinary approach that integrates detailed archaeological recording of the art itself, stylistic comparisons with other known rock art traditions, analysis of associated motifs within the panel or the wider site, and wherever possible and culturally appropriate, respectful and collaborative consultation with contemporary Indigenous elders and knowledge holders who may still retain the keys to understanding these ancient visual languages. Sometimes these carved human figures might represent sorcerers, clever men, or women, or spirit doctors. Individuals within the community believed to possess special spiritual powers, the ability to interact with the spirit world to heal the sick, or to influence events through ritual and esoteric knowledge. They might be depicted with specific attributes or in postures that signify their unique spiritual status. Or they could be representations of various kinds of spirits, both benevolent, perhaps guardian spirits, or helpful ancestral shades, and potentially malevolent or mischievous ones whose presence in the landscape needed to be acknowledged and respected. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the dynamism and artistry in some of these human depictions is the existence of what rock art researchers call dynamic figures. These are often found in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, though more famously as paintings like the Guion Guion or Bradshaw figures. The concept of dynamic human portrayal is relevant across art forms. These figures, even when rendered as simple outlines, are often depicted with an extraordinary sense of movement, energy, and grace. Running, leaping, dancing, throwing spears, captured with a remarkable economy of line and an intuitive understanding of human anatomy and motion. They are incredibly evocative, conveying a sense of vitality that seems to transcend the stillness of the stone itself. Trying to decipher the exact meaning or narrative behind a particularly complex panel of these dynamic, often overlapping human figures can sometimes feel like trying to understand the rules. The teams and the entire season highlights of an incredibly ancient, highly ritualized, and entirely unfamiliar sport, based only on a few frozen action shots and no commentary whatsoever. Okay. You might ponder a Guriah, so that figure with the very long spear and the impressively athletic leap. Is he joyfully celebrating a successful kangaroo hunt? Is he perhaps engaged in a ritual dance to appease the spirit of the local thunderstorm? Or is he just trying to win the ancient Indigenous Australian equivalent of the Olympic high jump? Possibly to impress that other stick figure over there, who appears to be holding a very large and potentially quite judgmental boomerang. The hidden meanings within these human shapes are often profound and multi-layered. The specific posture of a figure, the way its hands are held, the objects it carries, the headdress it wears, its relationship to other figures or symbols on the panel. All these details can carry immense significance, often accessible only to those with the appropriate level of initiated cultural knowledge. What might appear to an outsider as a simple depiction of a person could for an initiated elder be a complex map of sacred sites. A visual representation of kinship law is a crucial scene from a creation story or a powerful invocation of ancestral power. These human shapes, etched with such care and reverence into the ancient rock faces of Australia, are therefore far more than just portraits or genre scenes. They are windows into a rich spiritual and intellectual world, testaments to the enduring power of the dreaming and silent stone witnesses to the deep, unbroken connection between the first peoples, their ancestors, and their sacred, story-filled country. They are the immortalized spirits, the ever-present heroes, the dancing, hunting, and ceremonial figures who continue to inhabit these timeless galleries. You have now, Ejiraya, gazed upon the diverse and often enigmatic human-like figures etched into the ancient rock faces of Australia. Those anthropomorphic representations of ancestral beings, ceremonial dancers, potent sorcerers, or perhaps even ordinary people engaged in activities imbued with dreaming significance. You've pondered their varied postures, their symbolic adornments, and the hidden meanings that their silent, stony forms might convey across the vast gulf of time. But these figures, whether divine or mortal, rarely appear in a vacuum. They are often depicted interacting with, or defined by, the essential implements of their daily lives, their tools for survival, their weapons for hunting or conflict, and their sacred ceremonial objects. And so our sleepy exploration now turns to these life's implements. The boomerang, spear, shields, and other vital tools and weapons as they appear with reverence and telling detail in the ancient stone art of Indigenous Australia. It is a profound truth, Egeria, that the rock art of any ancient people serves not only as a window into their spiritual and mythological world, but also as an invaluable, if sometimes indirect, record of their material culture, their technologies, and the practical skills that underpin their daily existence. A mainstream historical fact is that Indigenous Australian rock art, including the petroglyph traditions we are considering frequently and often with remarkable accuracy, depicts a wide range of material culture items. These include various types of spears, spear throwers also known as wumeras or atlatls, boomerangs, shields, clubs, and sometimes also more domestic or utilitarian tools like digging sticks or carrying dishes. Coolamans. These representations provide archaeologists and anthropologists with crucial insights into the technology, the subsistence strategies, hunting, gathering, fishing, the social roles and the ceremonial life of these ancient indigenous peoples, often preserving images of items that, being made of perishable wood or fiber, have long since vanished from the direct archaeological record. Packing for a typical day out in ancient Australia Agria, if you were a hunter, probably involved a bit more than just your house keys and a reusable shopping bag. You definitely want your trusty spear or several of different types, your indispensable woomera for that extra launching, a couple of well-balanced boomerangs, perhaps one specifically for hunting kangaroos, and another more lightweight one for discouraging overly inquisitive flocks of cockatoos from raiding your campsite, and probably a very large, very sturdy shield, just in case you accidentally wandered into a rather heated, territorial dispute between rival emu spirit clans, or perhaps just needed to fend off a particularly grumpy and uncooperative goanna. It was your basic, everyday survival kit, Stone Age Australian style. As you examine these ancient stone carvings, you would frequently encounter spears depicted in the hands of hunters or warriors. These might be simple fire-hardened wooden points, or in later periods or different regions, more complex spears tipped with sharp stone flakes, bone points, or barbed wooden prongs. Sometimes the carvings are detailed enough to suggest different types of spears used for different purposes. Perhaps lighter ones for fishing, heavier ones for hunting large game like kangaroos or emus. Often accompanying the spear is the spear thrower, or woomera. This ingenious device, essentially a wooden shaft with a peg or hook at one end that engages the butt of the spear, acts as a lever, effectively lengthening the thrower's arm and allowing the spear to be launched with far greater velocity range and killing power. The woomera was a crucial technological innovation, a hallmark of Australian Indigenous hunting prowess, and its depiction in rock art, either held by a human figure or sometimes even as a standalone symbolic motif, underscores its immense importance. Then there are the boomerangs, perhaps one of the most iconic of all Indigenous Australian implements. While the returning boomerang, often used for sport or for startling birds into nets, is the most famous type, non-returning boomerangs heavier and often sharply curved or hooked, were highly effective hunting weapons capable of bringing down kangaroos or emus at considerable distances or used as fighting clubs in close combat. Rock art across many regions of Australia depicts these diverse boomerang forms, sometimes in the hands of hunters. Sometimes flying through the air, their distinctive aerodynamic shapes clearly recognizable even when pecked or incised into stone millennia ago. The boomerang, a true marvel of ancient aerodynamic engineering and intuitive physics. The Victorian gentleman we discussed in a previous Sleepy History Egeria would probably have tried to attach a tiny experimental steam engine to it, then written a very lengthy and incredibly stern etiquette manual on the correct and most socially acceptable way to not accidentally decapitate your esteemed hostess or shatter her prized collection of porcelain teacups while enthusiastically demonstrating its remarkable parlor trick potential. The ancient Indigenous Australians, however, just very effectively and with considerably less fuss, used it to help get dinner. Much more practical, all things considered. Shields also feature prominently, especially in scenes that might depict conflict or ceremonial display. These could vary greatly in shape and size, from small parrying shields used in close combat to larger, broader shields offering more substantial protection. Often in painted rock art traditions, shields are shown decorated with intricate clan designs or totemic symbols, and even in the monochrome world of petroglyphs, the carved outlines can sometimes suggest these important markings, signifying a warrior's identity and his spiritual connections. The precise function and exact symbolic meaning of many depictions of these tools and weapons within specific Indigenous Australian rock art contexts, whether they are primarily intended as literal, straightforward illustrations of daily subsistence activities like hunting or fishing, or if they are more deeply embedded within ceremonial magic, perhaps to ensure success in a future hunt, or to ritually capture the spirit of the prey, or serve as important markers of individual or group identity and status. A renowned hunter or warrior might be depicted with his characteristic implements, or are perhaps key narrative elements in the visual retelling of specific dreaming stories, involving ancestral hunts, legendary battles, or the very creation of these tools by ancestral beings, often require very careful consideration, demanding a holistic analysis of regional artistic conventions, the specific associated motifs within a given rock art panel, and wherever it is respectfully available and appropriate to share direct ethnographic information or Indigenous oral testimony from the traditional custodians of that particular site and its stories. You might also see depictions of more domestic or utilitarian implements, particularly those associated with the vital economic and social roles of women. Digging sticks, simple but essential tools used by women for harvesting yams. Roots, tubers, and small animals from the earth might be shown. Coolamans, those beautifully versatile curved wooden or bark. Carrying dishes used by women for gathering plant foods, carrying water, cradling infants. And even sometimes for winnowing seeds could also be represented their presence in the art. A quiet testament to the daily labor and sustenance provided by women. The detail in some of these ancient carvings of everyday tools and weapons agria is often quite incredible. You can almost feel the heft of the stone axe, the balance of the spear, the smooth curve of the coolaman. The artists weren't just vaguely sketching these items from memory. They were depicting objects with which they had an intimate daily working familiarity. It's like some of these carved spears look so perfectly realistically rendered you half expect to find a tiny, almost invisible Made in the Dreamtime by Uncle Wobblygun. The exceptionally talented Spearmaker Patent Pending label meticulously pecked into the wooden shaft. The attention to detail for life's essential implements was clearly very, very high. A particularly fascinating, quirky, or fringe tidbit that highlights the immense antiquity of some of this material culture, as revealed by rock art, is that some of the very oldest securely dated depictions of tools and weapons, perhaps from sites tens of thousands of years old, sometimes show types of boomerang spear throwers or even hafted stone axes that are stylistically quite different from, or perhaps ancestral to, those used by indigenous peoples in more recent historical times, or those collected by early European ethnographers. These ancient images provide invaluable, almost unique archaeological clues about long-term technological change, cultural evolution, and the deep history of innovation within Indigenous Australian societies over truly vast spans of time. It's like finding a perfectly preserved 40,000-year-old blueprint for a Stone Age iPhone, or at least a significantly more efficient prehistoric spear delivery system. The depiction of these life's implements in the ancient stone carvings is therefore far more than just a catalog of tools. It is a reflection of essential skills of subsistence, strategies of social roles, of ritual practices, and of the deep interconnected relationship between the people, their ancestors, their law, and the land that sustained them. Each carved spear, each pecked boomerang, each incised shield whispers a story of daily life of survival and of enduring cultural tradition in ancient Australia. You have now, Egeria, patiently traced the outlines of ancient Indigenous Australian life as it was etched into enduring stone. You've seen how the petroglyphs depict the formidable ancestral beings who shaped the land, the revered fauna that were both sustenance and kin, the enigmatic human-like figures engaged in ceremony or daily pursuits, and even the essential implements, the spears, the boomerangs, the shields, that defined their material culture and their means of survival. These carvings are a profound testament to a worldview deeply rooted in the tangible realities of country, in the intricate web of life that unfolded upon its sacred surface. But what of the world above? What of the vast, star-drenched skies that arched over the ancient Australian continent each night? Did these celestial realms also find their echo in the stone carvings below? And what secrets might they whisper of the cosmos as understood by its first peoples? A mainstream historical fact, and one that is increasingly recognized and celebrated, is that Indigenous Australian cultures possess incredibly rich, complex, and ancient astronomical knowledge and oral traditions. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been meticulous observers of the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, and other celestial phenomena like comets, meteors, and eclipses. This profound sky knowledge was not just an academic curiosity. It was deeply interwoven with their dreaming narratives, their social laws, their kinship systems, their calendrical systems for predicting seasons and resource availability, their methods of long-distance navigation across often featureless landscapes, and their sacred ceremonies. The ancient Indigenous Australians, Egeria, didn't need fancy, expensive telescopes, complicated astrophysical equations, or a subscription to Celestial Mechanics Monthly to have a profound, intimate, and highly practical connection with the cosmos. They had the magnificent, unpolluted canvas of the outback night sky, truly incredible observational skills honed over countless millennia, and probably some very, very good stories about precisely why that particularly bright cluster of stars over there looks suspiciously like a rather grumpy but ultimately quite benevolent celestial wombat who seems to have misplaced his favorite digging stick somewhere in the Milky Way. Given this deep cultural engagement with the heavens, it is almost inevitable that the sky and its myriad inhabitants and phenomena would also find expression in their rock art. However, identifying and interpreting specific celestial carvings and petroglyphs can be an exceptionally challenging and often highly speculative endeavor, Egeria. Unlike some other ancient cultures that developed more literal or pictographic systems for representing constellations like the zodiac signs of Mesopotamia or Egypt, Indigenous Australian celestial symbolism is often highly abstract, deeply metaphorical, and frequently tied to specific localized dreaming stories, whose full meanings may only be accessible through initiated cultural knowledge. A simple carved circle, for instance, might represent the sun or the full moon in one context, but in another, as we've seen, it could signify a waterhole, a campsite, or sacred ceremonial ground. The definitive identification and precise astronomical interpretation of many purported celestial motifs, or even deliberate site alignments within ancient Indigenous Australian rock art traditions, particularly for very old petroglyphs, where direct ethnographic explanation from knowledge holders is no longer available or is restricted, remains a subject of considerable ongoing scholarly debate and meticulous interdisciplinary research. This often requires a cautious synthesis of archaeological evidence, the motifs themselves, their placement, their orientation, anthropological records of more recent indigenous astronomical knowledge from that region, where such connections can be plausibly inferred. Comparative studies of celestial symbolism across different indigenous cultures, and sometimes even advanced techniques like archaeoastronomical analysis to test for potential alignments with significant solar, lunar, or stellar events. Despite these challenges, there are certainly motifs in the stone carvings that strongly suggest a celestial connection. Carvings of radiating circles or rayed discs are often plausibly interpreted as representing the sun, that powerful source of warmth, light, and life itself, often a significant ancestral being in many dreaming narratives. Perhaps a sun woman whose daily journey across the sky brought light to the world. Crescent shapes or full discs, sometimes with enigmatic internal markings that might even suggest facial features, could well be representations of the moon, another key celestial player often associated with tides, timekeeping, female cycles, and its own complex set of dreaming stories, perhaps involving a moon man and his various celestial adventures or misadventures. Depictions of stars or star clusters are perhaps even more common, though often harder to definitively identify as specific constellations in our Western sense. Groups of pecked dots, small circles, or star-like radiating patterns might represent well-known asterisms like the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, whose dreaming story is remarkably widespread and varied across Australia. The belt and scabbard of Orion, often seen as a celestial hunter, or a group of young men in indigenous traditions, or the Southern Cross. A particularly fascinating and quirky, if you're a fan of looking at the night sky tidbit, is the widespread Indigenous Australian recognition of dark constellations. Shapes formed not by the stars themselves, but by the dark dust lanes and interstellar clouds within the Milky Way. The most famous of these is the emu in the sky, a vast emu-shaped darkness clearly visible in the southern hemisphere's Milky Way during certain times of the year. The position of this celestial emu in the sky often served as a crucial seasonal marker, for instance, signaling the time for collecting emu eggs. It is highly plausible that some abstract arrangements of pecked areas or cleared spaces on rock surfaces might be attempts to represent these significant dark constellations, or that certain rock art sites themselves were deliberately oriented towards their rising or setting. Imagine Egeria trying to find a giant, dark, mu-shaped absence of stars in a sky already blazing with an overwhelming number of unfamiliar southern constellations. It requires a completely different way of seeing a profound attunement to the subtle patterns of the night. And what of more transient celestial events could those enigmatic meandering lines or sudden streaks sometimes represent comets, meteors, or even aurorae? All of which would have been awe-inspiring and possibly rather alarming sights to ancient peoples undoubtedly incorporated into their cosmological understanding and perhaps recorded in stone. It's a tantalizing possibility. Beyond depicting individual celestial bodies, the very placement and orientation of some rock art sites, or specific panels of carvings within them, might have held astronomical significance. Some researchers have proposed that certain sites or engravings are aligned with the solstices or equinoxes, or with the rising or setting points of particular bright stars or planets at specific times of the year. Such alignments, if proven, would suggest that these sites were not just art galleries, but also observatories, calendars, and places for performing ceremonies tied to the great cycles of the cosmos. The dreaming stories themselves are, of course, replete with celestial narratives. The sun, the moon, the stars, the Milky Way, all are often the transformed bodies of ancestral beings or the results of their epic creative acts during the Dreamtime. These sky dreamings explain the origins and movements of celestial bodies, their relationships to each other, and their profound influence on life on Earth. The rock art, therefore, in depicting these celestial symbols or the ancestral beings associated with them, would be serving as a vital visual link to this upper world, a way of bringing the power and meaning of the sky dreaming down to Earth and integrating it into human ceremony and understanding. Forget your modern, often rather dry planetarium shows with their laser pointers and slightly monotonous narrators. The ancient Indigenous Australian version was far more immersive. Imagine sitting around a crackling fire on a clear outback night, an elder pointing up at the blazing Milky Way, then gesturing towards an ancient nearby rock carving, depicting the same celestial river, and then, through song and story, weaving together the sky above the stone below and the very spirit of your country into one seamless sacred narrative. That's a celestial drama with real depth. You might see a particularly complex panel of 73 carefully pecked dots of varying sizes arranged next to a beautifully rendered crescent shape, and what appears to be a series of interconnected wavy lines. Is it a highly accurate, astronomically sophisticated star chart of the Pleiades star cluster and its precise relationship to the moon ancestor's left celestial toenail during the annual Yam Harvest Festival, all linked by the songline of the Great Water Serpent? Or did someone just get a little bit over-enthusiastic with the hammerstone after consuming a particularly large and inspirationally potent meal of roasted goanna and fermented quandong juice? The mysteries, as always. Egeria abound, and that is half their sleepy charm. For the first peoples of Australia, the sky world was not a remote, abstract realm separate from their daily existence. It was an integral part of their country, their law, their dreaming. The stars were ancestors, the sun and moon were powerful creative beings, and their movements provided a sacred calendar that governed both ceremony and subsistence. The stone carvings that seem to whisper of these celestial connections are therefore not just astronomical observations. They are profound expressions of a worldview where the earth and the sky are bound together in an eternal sacred dance. You have now, Egeria, journeyed with your mind's eye across the vast, ancient Australian continent, from the sun-drenched petroglyph-covered rocks of Murujuga to the sandstone galleries of the Sydney Basin, and even peered up into the star-dusted outback sky, contemplating how the celestial drama might be reflected in the stone carvings below. You've begun to decode the common motifs, the animal tracks, the human-like figures, the enigmatic circles and lines, and you understand that these are not just pictures, but profound visual narratives, tangible echoes of the dreaming, often depicting the very creation of the land, its creatures and its sacred law by the great ancestral beings. But these timeless galleries of Indigenous Australian rock art, these places where stories are etched in stone, are far more than just ancient libraries or open-air museums. They are, in a very deep and enduring sense, sacred ground, powerful ceremonial locations, and repositories of often carefully guarded restricted lore. A mainstream historical fact, and one that is absolutely fundamental to appreciating the true significance of this ancient heritage, is that many Indigenous Australian rock art sites are considered exceptionally sacred places by their traditional custodians. These are not merely locations with art. The art itself and the place it inhabits are often integral to the spiritual power and ongoing ceremonial importance of that specific piece of country. These sites are frequently located where ancestral beings performed significant creative acts during the dreaming, where they emerged from the earth, where they rested on their epic journeys, where they battled, loved, hunted, or instituted crucial laws and rituals. The presence of the rock art serves as a permanent visible reminder of these foundational events, a direct link to the power and presence of those ancestors. Wandering into one of these ancient Indigenous Australian rock art sites, especially one still holding active ceremonial significance without a proper invitation from the traditional custodians, and a deep understanding of the appropriate protocols, was and still is probably not a particularly good idea, Egeria. It's not like casually strolling into your local municipal art gallery to admire a few pretty landscapes. It's more akin to attempting to crash a very exclusive, incredibly sacred, and potentially quite spiritually potent, members-only celestial garden party. Possibly one being hosted by the Rainbow Serpent herself, or perhaps Great Uncle Barry, the benevolent bandicoot spirit, in his more formidable ceremonial aspect. You might not just get politely if firmly asked to leave, you might in some traditional views inadvertently offend some very powerful spiritual forces, or risk disrupting a delicate cosmic balance, possibly resulting in a sudden unexplained plague of unusually aggressive witchetty grubs, or a prolonged and very inconvenient drought. Respect for sacred ground is paramount. Many of these rock art sites were, and in some regions continue to be, vital ceremonial locations. They are not just places to look at art, they are places to do things, to perform the rituals that maintain the connection to the dreaming, that renew the life of the land, and that pass on sacred knowledge to new generations. Imagine Egeria, a gathering of initiated individuals at a secluded rock shelter, its walls covered with ancient carvings of their totemic ancestors and sacred symbols. By the flickering light of a fire, they might chant the ancient songs that recount the dreaming stories depicted on the rock. Their bodies painted with traditional designs, their movements reenacting the deeds of the ancestral beings. The art itself is an active participant in the ceremony. Certain images might be touched, retouched in the case of paintings, or even re-engraved or repecked for petroglyphs. As we've noted as part of the ritual, an act designed to renew their spiritual power, to awaken the dreaming essence within the stone, and to ensure the continuity of the law. These aren't just pretty pictures on rocks that you admire from a safe distance. In many traditional contexts, touching a specific highly charged carving of, say, the kangaroo ancestor, during a particular increase ceremony while singing the correct sacred songs and performing the prescribed ritual actions with the proper intent, might be believed to directly help ensure that there are plenty of actual physical kangaroos available for the community to hunt and sustain themselves in the coming season. It's like having a direct artistically mediated and highly effective hotline to the cosmic kangaroo supply chain manager, or perhaps the divine chief executive of sustainable resource regeneration. Very practical and very sacred. This brings us to the crucial concept of guarded lore and restricted knowledge. The stories and symbols depicted in Indigenous Australian rock art often possess multiple layers of meaning. Some aspects, the more public or outside stories, might be shared with the wider community, including women and uninitiated children serving as general moral tales, explanations of natural phenomena, or introductions to basic cultural values. However, the deeper, more sacred, and often more powerful meanings of many sites and specific images were, and in many traditional contexts, still are strictly restricted knowledge. This knowledge is revealed only to individuals who have attained the appropriate level of seniority, who have passed through specific, often arduous rites of initiation, or who belong to the particular kin group or moiety that holds custodial responsibility for that specific dreaming story and its associated sites. The precise nature and full extent of this, often highly compartmentalized and hierarchically restricted sacred knowledge associated with specific ancient petroglyph sites, particularly those from periods of deep antiquity where direct ethnographic continuity to living knowledge holders is less clear or has been disrupted, and exactly how different levels of profound meaning might have been encoded within the art or accessed and understood by various members of ancient Indigenous society, based, for example, on their age, their gender, their ritual status, or their specific totemic affiliations, are incredibly complex questions that archaeologists and anthropologists approach with extreme sensitivity, always relying on the guidance, permissions, and interpretations offered by contemporary Indigenous elders and knowledge custodians where such collaboration is possible, culturally appropriate, and respectfully sought. This means that what an uninitiated outsider like ourselves Igurya on our sleepy journey might see as a collection of interesting, if somewhat enigmatic patterns and figures on a rock, an initiated elder might read as a complex legal document, a detailed genealogical chart, a sacred cosmological map, or a set of instructions for a vital life-sustaining ceremony. Some of these rock carvings, Egeria, are like ancient, incredibly sacred spoilers for the next higher level of the dreaming. Terribly sorry, young initiate, Ostatia, an elder might gently explain. But you can't possibly know what that particular, rather intriguing arrangement of concentric circles, intertwined snake-like lines, and those 73 meticulously pecked dots actually signifies until you've successfully completed your advanced initiation trials, which may or may not involve correctly identifying 17 different species of edible grubs purely by their philosophical outlook and their preferred style of subterranean burrowing. Do come back next year after the rains, and perhaps we can discuss the primary metaphysical implications of the third dot from the left. The concept of men's business and women's business is also often crucial here. Certain rock art sites, specific symbols, or particular dreaming stories and ceremonies would be the exclusive domain of initiated men, while others would belong to initiated women, each gender holding and transmitting their own sacred knowledge, vital for the spiritual and social health of the entire community. To access or even view sites or images belonging to the other gender without proper authority would be a serious transgression. The role of custodianship is therefore paramount. Specific indigenous kin groups, clans, or language groups have profound inherited responsibilities as the traditional custodians for particular rock art sites, and the dreaming stories, songs, dances, and ceremonies associated with them. This custodianship is not about ownership in a Western property rights sense. It is a sacred trust, a lifelong obligation to care for, protect, and maintain the spiritual integrity of these places, and to ensure that the knowledge they hold is passed down correctly to future generations. These ancient stone galleries, egeria, are therefore not just passive repositories of art. They are active, powerful, and often intensely sacred places, pulsating with the living energy of the dreaming. Their meanings layered and guarded, their stories whispered only to those who have earned the right to hear them. They are the very soul of the country, etched in stone. You have now, Egeria, journeyed through the timeless sacred galleries of ancient Indigenous Australia, where the very rock faces serve as enduring canvases for stories of the dreaming. You've seen how these petroglyphs, these pecked, incised, and abraded images, depict a rich tapestry of ancestral beings, totemic fauna, enigmatic human-like figures, and the essential implements of daily life and ceremony. You understand that these sites are far more than just collections of ancient art. They are powerful ceremonial locations, repositories of guarded lore, and vital links to an unbroken cultural heritage stretching back into an almost unimaginably deep past. But this very antiquity, this profound sense of deep time that emanates from these weathered stones, raises a crucial and often rather challenging question. Just how old are these carvings? How do we even begin to comprehend, let alone scientifically measure, the immense spans of time over which these sacred stories have been etched into the Australian landscape? A mainstream historical fact, and one that often presents a significant hurdle for researchers, is that dating ancient rock art, particularly petroglyphs, stone carvings, is an incredibly complex scientific challenge. Unlike rock paintings, pictographs, which sometimes incorporate organic materials like charcoal or beeswax in their pigments, that can be directly dated using techniques like radiocarbon dating, though even this can be problematic and is of course a destructive process, requiring a tiny sample of the art itself. Petroglyphs, by their very nature as removals of the rock surface, usually do not contain any easily datable organic material directly within the carving itself. The act of pecking, incising, or abrading the stone doesn't conveniently embed a handy little carbon-14 clock for future archaeologists to consult. Trying to get a silent, impassive rock to tell you its precise age, or more specifically, the exact date when some long-vanished ancestor decided to meticulously carve a rather elegant emu track onto its weathered surface, is notoriously difficult at Egeria. Rocks you see are generally very stoic, very tight-lipped about their personal histories. You can't just politely inquire, "Excuse me, Mr. Sandstone Panel of Deep Cultural Significance. If you wouldn't mind, could you possibly recall whether you were first artistically engraved during the late Pleistocene, era of the slightly annoyed giant mega-wombat, or perhaps during the somewhat later, more abstract Holocene, period of intriguing circles that might be waterholes, or possibly just very, very old pizza designs?" It requires a tad more scientific finesse, and often a great deal of patient multidisciplinary detective work. So how do archaeologists and rock art specialists attempt to unravel this mystery of deep time and assign ages to these ancient stone carvings? They employ a range of methods, often indirect, relative, or requiring very specific geological or archaeological contexts. One approach is stylistic analysis. Researchers might compare the styles of carvings found at one site with those from other sites, or with painted rock art that can be more securely dated. They look for changes in technique, subject matter, or artistic conventions over time, trying to build up a relative chronology, a sense of which styles are older or younger than others. However, this method relies on assumptions about how styles evolve, which can be culturally specific and not always linear or predictable. Another common method is the study of superimposition. At many rock art sites, especially those used over vast periods, you can find images carved or painted directly on top of earlier ones. If one carving clearly overlies another, it gives a straightforward relative sequence. The underlying image is older, the overlying one is younger. By carefully documenting these layers of art, researchers can build up a local or regional stratigraphy of styles. The degree of patination or weathering on a petroglyph can also offer a rough, though often highly unreliable indication of its age. Patina, or desert varnish, is that dark weathered skin that forms on rock surfaces over long periods of exposure to the elements. When an artist creates a petroglyph by pecking or incising through this dark patina, they expose the lighter, unweathered rock beneath. Over more millennia, this newly exposed surface will itself begin to repatinate and weather, gradually darkening, and sometimes becoming almost indistinguishable from the original rock face. The more heavily repatinated a carving appears, the older it is generally assumed to be. However, the rate of patination and weathering is incredibly variable depending on the type of rock, the local climate, humidity, temperature fluctuations, rainfall, the degree of exposure to sun, wind, and abrasive sand, and even the specific microenvironment of the rock shelter or panel. So while it can give a general sense of very old versus less old, it's rarely precise. Perhaps the most reliable, though still often indirect method for dating rock art involves its association with datable archaeological deposits. If petroglyphs are found within a rock shelter or cave that also contains stratified layers of human occupation, such as ancient hearths with charcoal that can be radiocarbon dated or stone tools of a known typological age, and if it can be reasonably argued that the art was created during one of those periods of occupation, for instance. If a carved rock fragment falls from a panel and is found sealed within a datable archaeological layer, then this can provide a minimum or sometimes even a maximum age for the art. This is often the strongest line of evidence for establishing great antiquity. More recently, scientists have been developing and refining techniques to date mineral accretions or coatings that sometimes form directly over the surface of rock art. These can include thin layers of silica oxalate crusts or even wasp nests or termite tracks that have become fossilized on top of the carvings. If these overlying mineral layers or organic remains can be dated using methods like optically stimulated luminescence, OSL uranium series dating, or radiocarbon dating for organic inclusions, then this provides a minimum age for the rock art underneath. It has to be older than the stuff covering it up. This is a very promising avenue of research, though it requires specific geological conditions and highly specialized laboratory analysis. Scientists trying to precisely date some of these incredibly ancient carvings at Gria are engaged in a truly epic struggle against time and the elements. Okay, team, a determined archaeoscientist might exclaim, armed with a tiny laser and a collection of very small, very precisely labeled sample bags. We've meticulously analyzed the microlaminations in the desert varnish. We've measured the cosmogenic nuclide exposure on the rock surface. We've consulted the spectral signature of the overlying silica skin. And we've even, just for good measure, attempted to radiocarbon date that fossilized prehistoric insect that appears to have unfortunately expired directly on top of that rather enigmatic emu track. And our best, most scientifically rigorous guess is that this particular carving is somewhere between really astonishingly old and unbelievably, almost incomprehensibly, mind-bogglingly ancient. Plus or minus a few thousand years, of course. Glad we could clear that up with such definitive precision. The depiction of extinct fauna or very archaic types of tools, as we've touched upon before, can also provide clues to great antiquity. If a rock carving clearly and unambiguously depicts an animal known from the fossil record to have gone extinct, say, 20,000 or 30,000 years ago, or a type of stone spear point known only from very early archaeological contexts, then it strongly suggests the art itself must date from that period. However, identifying these ancient depictions with certainty can be highly contentious, requiring expert zoological or archaeological knowledge and careful consideration of stylistic conventions. A quirky or fringe tidbit in the ongoing quest for dating rock art is the experimental technique of micro-erosion dating. This attempts to measure the almost infinitesimally slow microscopic weathering and erosion of individual peck marks or incised lines on a rock surface over time. In theory, by understanding the local erosion rates, one might be able to calculate how long a carving has been exposed. However, this technique is still highly experimental. Its reliability and universal applicability are much debated among scientists, and it requires incredibly precise measurements and a host of assumptions about environmental stability. It's a bit like trying to tell cosmic time by meticulously measuring how slowly a single very patient grain of sand wears down when exposed to a gentle breeze. The precise antiquity of the very earliest securely dated Indigenous Australian rock art, and the ongoing quest to reliably date specific motif styles or entire rock art provinces across the continent to particular periods in deep prehistory remains a subject of intense cutting-edge scientific research, and sometimes quite vigorous, if usually very polite scholarly debate. Often because different dating techniques frequently have their own inherent limitations, their specific ranges of applicability, their potential sources of contamination or error, and almost always require highly context-specific calibration, careful cross-verification, and deeply considered interpretation and collaboration with archaeological and environmental data. What is undeniably clear, Egeria, is that many of these stone carvings are of immense antiquity, pushing back the timeline of human artistic and symbolic behavior to tens of thousands of years ago. Some sites in Australia have produced minimum dates for petroglyphs that are among the oldest reliably dated rock art anywhere in the world, placing them firmly within the Pleistocene epoch, the last ice age. This deep time perspective is crucial. It means that these traditions of etching stories and sacred symbols into stone have been maintained, adapted, and passed down through countless generations, through profound environmental changes and across vast cultural landscapes, a truly remarkable testament to the resilience and enduring spiritual depth of Indigenous Australian cultures. These aren't just old stones, they are ancient libraries, their pages turned by the winds of millennia. You have now, Egeria, journeyed through the vast sun-drenched landscapes and the even vaster stretches of deep time that characterize the ancient rock art of Indigenous Australia. You've contemplated the sacred power of the dreaming that infuses these stone carvings, the diverse symbols and motifs that whisper of ancestral beings, totemic animals, and human figures engaged in ceremony or daily life. You've marveled at the depictions of ancient tools and weapons, and even peered up at the night sky to consider how its celestial dramas might be etched into these enduring rock canvases. And you've pondered the immense challenges of dating these petroglyphs, of trying to assign precise numbers to an artistic and spiritual tradition that stretches back tens of thousands of years, making it one of the oldest continuous cultural legacies on our planet. But this very antiquity, this profound connection to a time beyond easy comprehension, also makes this heritage incredibly precious, and in our modern world, increasingly fragile. As our sleepy exploration continues, we must now, with a sense of gentle urgency, reflect on the many threats that these irreplaceable stone stories face today and the crucial ongoing efforts to protect and preserve them for future generations. A mainstream historical fact, and a rather sobering one, is that ancient Indigenous Australian rock art sites, including those vast, breathtaking outdoor galleries of petroglyphs, we've imagined face numerous significant and often accelerating threats in the modern era. Despite their apparent permanence being etched into stone, these carvings are not indestructible. They are vulnerable to both natural processes of decay and, with increasing intensity, the direct and indirect impacts of human activity. Their preservation and the safeguarding of the immensely rich Indigenous cultural heritage they represent is a matter of urgent global concern. Let's first consider the natural weathering and erosion processes that have been slowly, patiently at work on these rock surfaces for millennia. The harsh Australian sun beats down, causing thermal expansion and contraction that can gradually weaken the rock. Wind, often carrying abrasive sand particles, can act like a slow, relentless sandblaster, wearing away delicate peck marks and incised lines. Rain, especially in monsoonal or tropical regions, can dissolve certain minerals in the rock, cause water to seep into cracks and fissures, and encourage the growth of lichen moss algae or even destructive salt crystals on the rock surface, all of which can obscure or damage the ancient carvings. Animals, too, can inadvertently cause harm. Perhaps cattle or feral goats rubbing against a rock panel or termites building their nests over delicate engravings. For 40,000 years, Egeria, that particularly sacred and beautifully rendered emu carving, might have bravely stoically withstood the worst that wind rain, and the occasional overly enthusiastic back-scratching wallaby could throw at it. Then along comes the 21st century with a significant increase in atmospheric pollutants leading to slightly more acidic rain, or perhaps a subtle shift in local humidity levels due to regional land clearing, and suddenly our ancient noble emu finds itself facing a whole new and rather more chemically aggressive set of existential challenges. The poor long-suffering bird never really stood a chance against advanced atmospheric chemistry and its long-term geological consequences. But while these natural processes are ongoing, it is the modern human impact that poses the most acute and rapidly accelerating threats to this fragile heritage. As Australia has developed particularly over the last 2 centuries, many rock art sites have come under immense pressure. Industrial development is a major concern in some regions. Mining operations, oil and gas, exploration and extraction activities. The magnificent petroglyphs of Murjuga, the Burrup Peninsula, for example, are located in very close proximity to major gas processing plants and port facilities, leading to ongoing concerns about the impact of industrial emissions on the rock patina and the construction of new roads. Dams, pipelines, or other infrastructure can directly destroy sites or irrevocably alter their surrounding environment. Agricultural encroachment also takes its toll. The clearing of land for farming or pastoralism can expose previously sheltered rock art sites to increased weathering, alter local water tables, or led to damage from livestock or agricultural machinery. Urban sprawl as towns and cities expand into areas that were once remote bushland can also directly threaten sites that lie in the path of development. Then there is the impact of tourism. While well-managed, respectful tourism can play a positive role in raising awareness and providing economic benefits for indigenous communities involved in site management, uncontrolled or poorly managed access can be devastating. People touching or rubbing the carvings, which deposits oils and acids from their skin, and can wear away the delicate patina, kicking up dust that abrades the rock surfaces. Accidentally brushing against panels with backpacks, or even just the increased humidity from many people breathing in a confined rock shelter can all cause cumulative damage. And then, of course, there is the ever-present and utterly heartbreaking issue of vandalism and ignorance. Some people sadly deliberately deface these sacred and irreplaceable sites with graffiti, or carelessly damage them through thoughtless actions, often because they simply do not understand their immense cultural and historical significance. Some particularly misguided individuals might see an ancient, incredibly sacred rock carving that represents a direct, tangible link to tens of thousands of years of continuous human history, spirituality, and artistic expression and think, very interesting. But you know what would really improve this 30,000-year-old spiritually potent depiction of the great rainbow serpent creating the local river system? My initials, Baza Waz Ere 24, deeply and irrevocably scratched in with a conveniently sharp piece of rusty metal I just happened to find nearby. The mind of Egeria truly boggles at such breathtaking, destructive ignorance. Climate change is now recognized as another major overarching threat, exacerbating many of the natural weathering processes. More extreme weather events, intense heat waves, prolonged droughts followed by torrential downpours, increased frequency or intensity of cyclones in coastal regions, can all accelerate the decay of rock surfaces. Rising sea levels also pose a direct threat to coastal rock art sites, including some with very ancient petroglyphs. And more frequent or intense bushfires can cause rock surfaces to spall crack or become blackened by smoke damaging or obscuring the art. The preservation of this fragile heritage Egeria is therefore a complex and urgent task. Despite being carved in stone, these ancient stories are not indestructible. Once a petroglyph is lost to weathering, damaged by industry, or defaced by vandalism, it is gone forever. And with it a piece of irreplaceable human history, a vital link to the dreaming, and a profound expression of indigenous cultural identity vanishes from the world. For indigenous communities, the destruction of these sites is not just an archaeological loss, it is a deep spiritual and cultural wound, a severing of connection to their ancestors, their law, and their country. The most effective, ethically sound, and culturally appropriate long-term strategies for successfully balancing the crucial preservation needs of these ancient indigenous Australian rock art sites with the often powerful and competing demands of modern economic development, essential resource extraction, the desire for increased tourism access, and above all upholding the inherent access rights, cultural obligations and custodial responsibilities of the traditional owners of that country remain subjects of incredibly complex, highly sensitive, and constantly evolving negotiations, policy debates, and ethical discussions among all stakeholders involved: indigenous communities, government heritage agencies, scientific researchers, industry proponents, and the wider public. Fortunately, there are increasingly dedicated efforts underway to protect and conserve this extraordinary heritage. At the forefront of these efforts are indigenous custodians and communities themselves, who are increasingly taking a leading role in managing their sacred sites, often through indigenous ranger programs, cultural heritage surveys, and direct involvement in conservation decisions. Legislation at both national and state levels provides varying degrees of legal protection for rock art sites, and some, like the Uber and Nourlungi sites in Kakadu National Park, though famous primarily for paintings, have achieved World Heritage listing, recognizing their global significance. Murujuga itself is currently undergoing a long process towards potential World Heritage nomination. Archaeological and conservation science is also playing a vital role developing new techniques for monitoring the condition of rock art, documenting it in minute detail, often using non-invasive methods like 3D laser scanning and high-resolution digital photography, analyzing the complex processes of rock weathering, and in some carefully considered cases, undertaking interventive conservation treatments to stabilize fragile surfaces or remove damaging accretions. A quirky or fringe tidbit here is that some of these modern conservation efforts involve an almost surreal blend of ancient wisdom and cutting-edge 21st century technology. You might have traditional owners working alongside scientists using high-powered lasers for incredibly delicate cleaning of ancient rock surfaces, or creating phenomenally detailed 3D digital archives of entire vast rock art landscapes, all while also incorporating traditional indigenous land management practices like controlled cool season burning to protect sites from devastating hot season bushfires. It's a fascinating interface of millennia-old cultural knowledge and the very latest scientific innovation. And finally, Agraya public education and awareness are crucial. The more people who understand the immense antiquity, the profound cultural significance, and the current fragility of these stone stories, the greater the collective will to protect them. Promoting respectful tourism where visitors learn from indigenous guides and treat these sacred sites with the reverence they deserve is a vital part of this. Trying to protect these incredibly ancient, deeply sacred, and often quite remote rock art sites. Egeria is like trying to keep a very, very old, exceptionally delicate, and unimaginably famous outdoor public library safe from literally everything. From unexpected flash floods and overly enthusiastic lichen growth to slightly too curious feral goats and occasionally, alas, some profoundly misguided tourists armed with selfie sticks, and a fundamental, almost tragic, misunderstanding of the critically important concept of please, for the love of all that is ancient and sacred, do not touch the 40,000-year-old artwork. It's a full-time global human heritage preservation emergency, and one that requires our utmost care, respect, and attention. You have now, Egeria, journeyed with a heavy heart through the very real and pressing concerns that surround the fragile heritage of ancient, indigenous Australian rock art. You've seen how these irreplaceable stone stories, these petroglyphs that have endured for tens of thousands of years now, face a barrage of threats in our modern world. From the slow, inexorable creep of natural weathering exacerbated by climate change to the more immediate and often devastating impacts of industrial development, agricultural encroachment, uncontrolled tourism, and sadly sometimes deliberate vandalism or sheer unthinking ignorance. You understand the urgent need for preservation, for the deployment of scientific conservation techniques, for protective legislation, and for widespread public education. But amidst all these vital efforts, there is one voice, one source of knowledge and authority that is absolutely paramount, utterly indispensable for the true understanding. The respectful management and the spiritual safeguarding of this ancient legacy. The voice of contemporary indigenous elders and traditional knowledge holders. For these are not just ancient archaeological sites, Egeria. For many First Peoples, these are living, breathing cultural landscapes still resonating with the power of the dreaming. And it is their elders who are the living links to that ancient art, the true guardians of its deepest secrets. A mainstream historical fact, and one that is increasingly, though sometimes belatedly, recognized as fundamental to best practice in this field, is that contemporary Indigenous Australian elders and knowledge custodians play an absolutely vital and increasingly central role in the research, interpretation, management, and ongoing preservation of ancient rock art sites across the continent. Their traditional ecological and cultural knowledge, which includes the often incredibly detailed dreaming stories, the sacred songs, the ceremonial significances, and the intricate kinship connections associated with specific sites, particular motifs and ancestral landscapes, provides invaluable, irreplaceable insights that are frequently entirely inaccessible through purely archaeological or Western scientific methods alone. An archaeologist Egeria might look at a complex panel of ancient rock carvings and, with meticulous scientific rigor, describe its stylistic conventions, analyze its patination attempt to date its various layers, and perhaps offer a cautious interpretation based on comparative iconographic studies. The archaeologist might thoughtfully pronounce adjusting their spectacles. This deeply pecked subcircular motif here with its radiating linear appendages appears to be stylistically consistent with the early Holocene period, and may possibly represent a solar symbol, or perhaps a totemic representation of a significant local invertebrate, possibly an unusually well-organized caterpillar. Hey, the indigenous elder accompanying them, a person who has been taught the stories of that specific place by their own elders, in an unbroken chain of oral tradition, stretching back into deep time, might then quietly add with a gentle smile, "Yes, that is indeed a very ancient and powerful marking. It represents the place where the great honey ant ancestor, during his epic Dreamtime journey from the western desert, paused to perform a sacred ceremony to ensure the continued abundance of honey ants for all our people. The radiating lines are his sacred song spreading out across the country, and the central circle is the entrance to his ceremonial ground, which is also by no coincidence an excellent place to find particularly delicious and spiritually potent honey ants, if you know precisely when and how to look. And also, we generally try not to discuss the specifics of the caterpillar aspect in front of the uninitiated children, as that particular part of the story is a bit sensitive and involves some rather complex inter-clan matrimonial law. Context Egeria provided by living cultural knowledge is everything. The complex ethical, intellectual, and methodological challenges involved in respectfully, equitably, and accurately integrating indigenous oral traditions, sacred or restricted cultural knowledge, and community-based perspectives with Western scientific approaches to rock art research, site management, and public interpretation remains a subject of ongoing critical discussion. Continuous learning and evolving best practice protocols within the fields of archaeology, anthropology, heritage management, and indigenous studies. This involves navigating crucial issues of intellectual property rights, indigenous data sovereignty, appropriate levels of public dissemination for sacred or sensitive information, and ensuring genuine collaborative partnerships where indigenous communities are not just informants, but active leaders and primary beneficiaries in the research and care of their own unparalleled cultural heritage. For millennia, this profound knowledge was passed down from generation to generation through oral tradition, through participation in ceremony, through direct experience on country. The rock art sites themselves were crucial classrooms, visual aids for teaching the young about their law, their dreaming, their responsibilities. The elders, both men and women, were the keepers of this sacred library, the ones who held the keys to its deepest meanings. Their understanding is not just academic, it is a lived spiritual connection. A quirky or fringe tidbit, though, one that speaks volumes about the depth of this connection, is that some highly knowledgeable indigenous elders, when visiting rock art sites with researchers, can sometimes identify not only the overarching dreaming stories depicted in a panel, but occasionally even the specific hand or distinctive artistic style of a particular ancestral artist or a known lineage of artists from the deep past. They might also recount incredibly detailed oral histories associated with the creation of certain images or specific ritual uses of the art that have been faithfully passed down through countless generations. It's like having the original artist's great, 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 great. Add a few more greats for good measure. Grandchild give you a personal, deeply insightful, and spiritually resonant guided tour of the family's most ancient and sacred art gallery, explaining not just what the pictures are of, but what they truly mean. Sadly, the devastating impacts of colonization in Australia, the dispossession of peoples from their traditional lands, the disruption of traditional lifestyles, the loss of indigenous languages, the imposition of foreign belief systems, and the often tragic breaking of intergenerational knowledge transmission have meant that in some regions, the direct specific cultural links to certain ancient rock art sites have been severely damaged, or even in some heartbreaking cases entirely lost. This makes the knowledge still held by contemporary elders in communities where traditions remain strong or are being actively revitalized all the more precious and all the more urgent to respectfully record and support always under Indigenous control and guidance. Today, there is a growing and vital movement towards Indigenous-led management of cultural heritage sites, including rock art locations. Indigenous ranger programs, community-based research projects, and collaborative partnerships between traditional owners, archaeologists, anthropologists, and conservation scientists are increasingly becoming the norm, and rightly so. These collaborations bring together the strengths of both indigenous knowledge systems and Western scientific approaches, leading to far richer, more nuanced, and more culturally appropriate understandings and management strategies for these irreplaceable sites. Modern rock art research Agiria is at its absolute best, its most insightful, and its most ethically sound when it's a genuine team effort. The scientists might bring their fancy radiometric dating techniques, their high-resolution 3D laser scanners, and their detailed chemical analyses of rock patination. The indigenous elders and knowledge holders bring tens of thousands of years of continuous cultural memory, a profound spiritual connection to the land and its stories, an unparalleled understanding of the local environment, and quite possibly a much, much better idea of where to find a decent, non-poisonous witchetty grub for lunch, or which particular direction to face when addressing the spirit of that rather grumpy-looking rock formation over there to ensure a peaceful and productive day of fieldwork. Everyone wins, especially the ancient art itself, when its true custodians are leading the way. The voices of indigenous elders, therefore, are not just a supplementary source of information about these ancient stone carvings. They are the living heart of their meaning, the enduring echo of the dreaming itself. To truly understand and protect this fragile heritage, we must first and always listen with profound respect to those whose ancestors first etched these timeless stories into the very soul of the Australian continent. Theirs are the whispers that can truly bring these ancient stones to life. The ancient sun-warmed rocks of Australia Egeria, etched with the profound stories of the dreaming, have shared some of their silent secrets with us. We have journeyed through vast landscapes and even vaster stretches of time, glimpsing a world where art, law, spirituality, and daily life were inextricably interwoven, where every feature of the land held meaning, and where ancestral beings sang the very cosmos into existence. We've marveled at the artistry of the petroglyphs, pondered their enigmatic symbols, considered the sacredness of the sites themselves, and acknowledged the immense challenge of dating and preserving this fragile, irreplaceable heritage. And most importantly, we have recognized the absolutely vital central role of Indigenous elders and their living cultural knowledge in truly understanding and safeguarding these ancient treasures. The story of Indigenous Australian rock art is a testament to the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, a narrative of resilience, profound spiritual connection, and breathtaking artistic creativity that has endured for tens of thousands of years. It is a story that continues to unfold as new discoveries are made, as new collaborations are forged, And as the voices of the first peoples are increasingly and rightly heard and respected, as the images of those carved kangaroos and emus, those dancing ancestral figures and those mysterious circles and lines now begin to gently fade into the soft quiet of your own approaching slumber, may you carry with you a deep appreciation for this extraordinary legacy. May you remember that these are not just relics of a distant past, but living heritage still resonating with power and meaning for Indigenous Australians today. And may your dreams be filled with the quiet wisdom of ancient stones and the enduring resilient spirit of the oldest storytellers on earth. The voices of contemporary Indigenous elders Ageria have now echoed in your sleepy contemplation, revealing how these ancient stone carvings are not merely relics of a forgotten past, but living heritage still pulsating with the sacred power of the dreaming. Their meanings carefully guarded and respectfully transmitted through millennia of continuous cultural tradition. You've seen how their knowledge is absolutely indispensable for any true understanding of this art, and how collaborative partnerships are crucial for its ethical research management and preservation in the face of numerous modern threats. Now, let us step back for a moment from the specific sites and individual stories and consider the broader global significance of this vast and ancient artistic legacy. Is Indigenous Australian rock art, particularly its petroglyph traditions, just a fascinating regional phenomenon? Or does it hold a unique, perhaps even unparalleled place in the grand, sweeping saga of human creativity and our species' earliest attempts to make sense of the world through symbolic expression? The answer, Igiraya, is a resounding affirmation of its profound global importance, a mainstream historical fact, and one that continues to inspire awe and reshape our understanding of deep human history, is that Indigenous Australian rock art represents one of the oldest, if not the oldest, and certainly one of the longest continuous artistic traditions anywhere in the world. As we've touched upon some rock art sites in Australia, encompassing both paintings and petroglyphs, have been dated through a variety of scientific techniques, often applied to associated archaeological deposits or mineral accretions overlying the art to incredible ages. 20,000 years, 30,000 years, 40,000 years, and in some particularly compelling, if still debated instances, potentially even older, perhaps approaching 50,000 or even 60,000 years before the present. This places the origins of this artistic tradition now firmly within the Pleistocene epoch, the last great ice age, a time when humans were first making their mark across many parts of the globe. While Europe boasts its famous Paleolithic cave art sites, like Lascaux in France or Altamira in Spain, with their magnificent depictions of bison, horses, and mammoths, dating roughly from around 35,000 to 15,000 years ago, the Australian rock art record often demonstrates an even greater time depth, and crucially an unbroken continuity of cultural practice that in many regions extended right up until the period of European colonization, and indeed continues in new forms today. It's like the difference between finding a single beautifully preserved volume of ancient poetry and discovering an entire vast interconnected library system that has been continuously curated, added to, and reinterpreted by an unbroken line of dedicated librarians for literally hundreds of human generations. Imagine the art scene, say, 40,000 years ago in various parts of the world. In one region, perhaps an early artist is tentatively making their first hand stencil on a cave wall. In another, someone is carving a small, enigmatic figurine from mammoth ivory. And meanwhile, in ancient Australia, their contemporaries are already engaged in creating vast, complex panels of deeply symbolic rock carvings, initiating an artistic and spiritual tradition that will endure for millennia upon millennia. The sheer scale and longevity are mind-boggling. This incredible antiquity and continuity make Indigenous Australian rock art an unparalleled archive of human cognitive and symbolic development. It provides crucial evidence for the early emergence of complex, abstract thought, sophisticated storytelling, deeply held religious or cosmological beliefs, intricate social organization, and a profound, spiritually imbued connection to the land and its specific environments. These ancient artists weren't just idly scratching pictures onto rocks. They were engaging in a deeply meaningful, culturally significant practice, creating visual systems to record and transmit knowledge, to perform ceremonies to define territory, and to affirm their place within the cosmos. This challenges older, often rather Eurocentric views of where art or civilization first truly began or reached its early peaks, demonstrating that Australia was in its own right a major ancient cradle of human symbolic creativity. The ongoing refinement and application of advanced scientific dating techniques for rock art, such as improvements in optically stimulated luminescence OSL dating of ancient wasp nests or mud dauber nests that might be built over or under rock engravings, or advancements in AMS radiocarbon dating of minuscule organic components within rock surface mineral accretions, or even directly associated paint binders for pictographs, I continues to push back the potential antiquity of the very earliest Indigenous Australian artistic expressions, prompting fascinating reassessments of global timelines for the development of human symbolic behavior, cognitive modernity, and the dispersal of early human populations across Sahul, the ancient continent of Australia and New Guinea. A quirky or fringe tidbit that often sparks considerable discussion among rock art researchers is that some of the earliest known depictions of human figures engaged in dynamic action, or what appear to be complex narrative scenes involving multiple interacting figures, are found in Australian rock art, potentially predating similar developments in some other well-known rock art regions of the world. For example, some very ancient Kimberley rock art, often paintings like the Gwion or Bradshaw figures. Though the dating of these is itself complex and debated, shows remarkably slender, elegantly adorned human figures in what appear to be ceremonial dances or processions, rendered with a surprising sense of movement and grace. While our primary focus here is petroglyphs, the broader Australian rock art tradition showcases this early capacity for sophisticated human representation and narrative composition. The diversity of styles, techniques, and subject matter across the Australian continent is another testament to the richness and longevity of this artistic legacy. From the dense fields of pecked animal tracks and geometric symbols at Murujuga, to the large outlined ancestral figures on Sydney sandstone, the intricate X-ray style paintings of Arnhem Land, which show both the external and internal anatomy of animals and humans, and the deeply engraved panoramity tradition of abstract symbols found across much of arid Central Australia. Each region, each cultural group developed its own unique visual language for expressing its dreaming, its law, and its connection to country. It's not a monolithic tradition. It's a vast interconnected library system with thousands of distinct yet often related volumes. The global significance of this heritage is increasingly recognized. Many major Indigenous Australian rock art sites are now protected under national and state heritage laws, and several, such as Kakadu National Park, with its incredible galleries of both paintings and engravings, and the Willandra Lakes region home to ancient human remains and some early art, have been inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, acknowledging their outstanding universal value to all of humanity. There is a growing international movement to secure World Heritage listing for Murujuga as well, to protect its unparalleled concentration of ancient petroglyphs from the ongoing threats of nearby industrial development. So while many ancient European cultures might have left behind some truly impressive stone circles, a few remarkably well-preserved bog bodies with surprisingly good haircuts, and perhaps a handful of undeniably catchy, if largely incomprehensible, ancient myths. Indigenous Australian Zagariah are quietly sitting on a cultural and artistic legacy that demonstrably stretches back further than almost any other continuous tradition on the entire planet. They were, in a very real sense, the original artistic overachievers, creating vast, continent-spanning galleries of profound spiritual art, not for a few centuries, but for tens of millennia. It's a legacy that demands our deepest respect, our most careful attention, and our most committed efforts at preservation. You have journeyed far Agiria across the vast sunburnt landscapes of ancient Australia, and even further back into the almost unimaginable depths of Dreamtime. Hi, yes, why? You've stood in hushed, imaginative awe before those timeless galleries of stone, where petroglyphs pecked, incised, and abraded by countless generations of indigenous artists whisper their enduring secrets of the dreaming. You've explored the foundational worldview that imbues these carvings with such profound spiritual power, encountered the formidable ancestral beings who shaped the land, and its law marveled at the reverent depictions of fauna and perhaps even long extinct megafauna, pondered the enigmatic human figures engaged in ceremony or ancient hunts, and considered the tools, weapons, and even celestial connections etched into these enduring rock canvases. You've understood the sacred nature of these sites, the guarded lore they often contain, the immense challenges of dating their antiquity, and the urgent pressing need to protect this fragile, irreplaceable heritage, always guided by the living wisdom of contemporary Indigenous elders, the true custodians of these ancient stories. Now, as our sleepy exploration draws to its gentle, respectful close, we must reflect on the timeless power, the enduring spirit, and the lasting resonant mystery of these ancient stones that still and always will whisper. The enduring spirit of this art egregia lies in its profound, unbroken connection to a living culture. A mainstream historical fact, and one that makes Indigenous Australian rock art utterly unique on a global scale, is that it represents one of the world's oldest continuous artistic and spiritual traditions. While many other magnificent prehistoric art forms around the world, the cave paintings of Lascaux, the megalithic carvings of Europe, belong to cultures that have long since vanished, leaving us to guess at their deepest meanings. Much of Indigenous Australian rock art is part of a heritage that, despite the devastating impacts of colonization, continues to live and breathe in the beliefs, ceremonies, and cultural practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. These are not just mute archaeological artifacts. For their traditional owners, these sites are not merely historical. They are living heritage, still imbued with the potent spiritual power of the dreaming, still resonating with the presence of the ancestors, still informing law and identity. The ongoing challenge, and indeed the profound ethical responsibility for non-Indigenous researchers, heritage managers, government agencies, and the wider global public in engaging with this ancient Indigenous Australian rock art, therefore lies in finding truly collaborative, ethically sound, and culturally respectful ways to appreciate, study, conserve, and interpret this extraordinary world heritage, always prioritizing Indigenous voices, perspectives, knowledge systems, and custodial rights, while humbly acknowledging the inherent limitations of ever fully or completely decoding its deepest, most sacred spiritual meanings from an external, non-initiated cultural perspective. The timeless power of these stone carvings stems from their ability to connect us, even as outsiders, to something incredibly ancient and profoundly human. When you gaze upon a petroglyph pecked into a rock face, perhaps 20 years like 30 snout, or even an astonishing 40,000 or more years ago, you are looking at a direct, tangible link to some of the earliest artistic and symbolic expressions of Homo sapiens. You are witnessing evidence of ancient minds grappling with the great mysteries of existence: creation, life; death, the nature of the cosmos, humanity's place within it; and finding ways to express those understandings through enduring art. It speaks to the fundamental human need to create meaning, to tell stories, to leave a mark, a legacy for future generations. Learning about this deep history of Egeria really puts your own family's slightly embarrassing but fondly remembered holiday traditions, and your great-aunt Mildred's famously indestructible fruitcake recipe, which some suspect may also date back to the early Holocene, into a rather different and significantly more modest historical perspective, doesn't it? The mystery that still clings to so much of this art, despite decades of dedicated research, is also a significant part of its enduring allure. While Indigenous elders can often provide profound insights into the meanings of sites and symbols within their own cultural traditions, some of the very oldest art, or art from regions where cultural knowledge has been severely disrupted, remains deeply enigmatic. Those abstract geometric patterns, those highly stylized figures, those unique regional motifs, what precise stories, what specific beliefs, what exact ceremonial functions did they once hold? The fact that we cannot always know that some secrets remain locked within the silent stone only adds to their fascination, inviting our contemplation, our respect, and our ongoing quest for understanding. So after all this agraya, do the ancient stones actually whisper their deepest secrets directly into your ear in a conveniently understandable language? Well, probably not in a way that your modern smartphone's translation app is ever likely to pick up. It's much more of a deep, ancient, almost subliminal kind of communication, a sense of profound presence that requires you to listen, not just with your ears, but with your heart, your intuition, your soul, and preferably with the generous guidance of a knowledgeable Indigenous elder who holds the appropriate cultural keys. And even then, you probably shouldn't expect them to suddenly reveal next week's winning lottery numbers or the precise location of a hidden vein of particularly shiny gold. Some secrets, after all, are best kept by the stones themselves. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the living, evolving nature of this artistic tradition is that some contemporary Indigenous Australian artists, working in modern mediums like canvas printmaking, sculpture, or digital art, continue to draw profound inspiration from ancient rock art motifs, dreaming stories, and traditional graphic systems. They are not merely copying the old forms, they are reinterpreting them, re energizing them, and bringing them into a contemporary dialogue, ensuring that this ancient artistic lineage remains a vibrant, dynamic, and continuously evolving expression of Indigenous culture and identity in the 21st century. This powerful continuity is a testament to the enduring spirit of the world's oldest storytellers. The whispers from these ancient stones, Agariah, are manifold. To Indigenous Australians, they whisper of identity, of belonging, of ancestral power, of sacred law, of the enduring connection to country that has sustained them for millennia. To non-Indigenous Australians, and indeed to all of humanity, if we choose to listen with humility and respect, they whisper of the incredible depth and resilience of human culture, of alternative ways of seeing and understanding the world, of the profound importance of caring for the land, and perhaps of the urgent need for reconciliation, and for a deeper appreciation of the first peoples who have cherished and protected this continent for so long. These are not just stories from ancient Australia, they are stories for all time. And so as we gently draw the veil of sleep over these timeless galleries and their deeply etched narratives, Egeria, we leave these ancient Australian rock carvings to their silent, sun-baked vigil. They have weathered countless seasons, witnessed unimaginable changes, and yet they remain their surfaces alive with the power of the dreaming. Their forms a testament to the enduring human spirit. We may never fully decode all their hidden meanings, never completely unravel all their ancient mysteries, but their beauty, their antiquity, and their profound spiritual significance will continue to inspire awe, provoke thought, and whisper their timeless secrets to those who come to them with an open mind and a respectful heart. The stones indeed still speak, if only we can learn to truly listen. The enduring mystery is in itself half the profound sleepy fun. The ancient sun-warmed rocks of Australia, Egeria, with their deeply etched stories of the dreaming, now begin to settle into the soft shadows of our sleepy historical journey's end. We have wandered through timeless galleries, marveling at the skill, the artistry, and the profound spiritual depth of the first peoples of this vast continent, a cultural heritage stretching back into an almost unimaginable antiquity. From the powerful ancestral beings who shaped the land and gave the law to the intricate symbols that map sacred geographies and transmit ancient knowledge, and the ongoing vital role of Indigenous elders. As the custodians and interpreters of this living legacy, we have glimpsed a world where art, spirit, and country are inextricably beautifully interwoven. The petroglyphs, those silent whispers from a deep time, speak of a resilience, a creativity, and a profound connection to place that has endured for tens of thousands of years. They remind us of the diversity of human experience, the many ways of seeing and understanding the cosmos, and the importance of cherishing and protecting the irreplaceable heritage of all cultures. As the images of those carved kangaroos, those enigmatic human figures, and those sacred story-filled landscapes now gently fade into the quiet of your own approaching slumber, may you carry with you a sense of profound respect and quiet wonder for these ancient storytellers in stone. And may your dreams be filled with the wisdom of deep time, the beauty of enduring art, and the peaceful spirit of a land that still whispers its most ancient secrets.